Welcome to the mental health training for first responders and frontline workers through Boots on the Ground. I'm Jake Mitchell. I am a current volunteer with Boots on the Ground, and also I worked as a paramedic in Nova Scotia, downtown Halifax, for about 4 years as a primary care paramedic. I then went to school for addictions and mental health at Centennial College, earning that diploma, and then becoming accredited under the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. So what I do a lot in my spare time is I do counseling and consulting for addictions and mental health related disorders for individuals and workplaces. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about that. I also work at a community health center in downtown Toronto doing overdose response, crisis intervention, and addictions and mental health case management for a very high-risk homeless population predominantly. And I work with a lot of the marginalized communities specifically, which gives me a lot more insight into the struggles they have and the barriers they face compared to the rest of the population. I also do casual work at a safe injection site in downtown Toronto, where we see some of the highest populations in all of Canada at this safe injection site, where I do basic life support, overdose response, crisis intervention, and support for the homeless population in Toronto at that site specifically. So hopefully I can bring all of that experience, plus my own experience struggling with depression and post-traumatic stress, to the table to be able to help everybody feel more confident and empowered with understanding the different mental health disorders and what exactly is addiction and substance use disorder when they leave this program. So when they're providing that type of support to your colleagues, to your family members, if you're struggling with addictions and mental health problem, you're able to pull from this course and take a lot of the tools and knowledge that I bring to you to be able to actually apply it effectively. So let's get the ball rolling, and welcome to the course. And here are the topics that we'll be going into during this course. Understanding mental health and reducing stigmas. We're going to go into the definition of mental health, how it fits into our society's perspective of well-being, and also those different biopsychosocial factors that affect us all differently on how we will all have different barriers, different strengths, and different risk factors when it comes to different mental health and addiction disorders. Also, we'll talk about how to reduce stigmas and understand what stigmas are and where they come from. Mood-related disorders. We're going to go into depression and what is depression. What is the definition between someone who's struggling with it acutely and someone who has depression as a disorder. We will then move into bipolar disorder and the wide spectrum of presentations that each person can have and the ways they'll cope with it differently. We'll also talk about the different resources and the different treatments that are available for these various mood-related disorders. Psychosis-related disorders we'll also go into. I'll dispel a lot of the myths and bring forward a lot of the realities of what psychosis-related disorders really are. Also, trying to help people look at it more as altered states more than psychosis, because the word psychosis itself can carry stigma, whereas looking at it as an altered state will make it a lot easier for you when working with people who are experiencing this. Moving into anxiety and trauma-related disorders. This is a big one for first responders. As I have my own struggles with depression, I also struggled quite a bit with anxiety and post-traumatic stress. As many people who are volunteering with Boots on the Ground can empathize, trauma-related disorders and anxiety are very underdiagnosed and underappreciated in our first responder field. So now we're finally seeing all this come to light, whereas when I started as a paramedic, we did not really have very much information on this stuff. So I'm very happy now that we have a lot to talk about when it comes to anxiety and trauma-related disorders. Then we'll have addiction and substance use disorders, where I'll actually give everyone a very easy definition on what addiction is, the difference between addiction and dependence, where a lot of people struggle grasping that difference there. Also, what is a substance use disorder versus somebody just using a substance? Where does it become a behavioral or substance use disorder versus someone's just doing something that makes them happy? There is a fine line. There's people who drink and there's alcoholics. There are people who use cannabis and there's people who have cannabis use disorder. There are people who have opioid use disorder and people who use painkillers for pain. What are the differences? And we'll go into those intricacies and nuances as well. When it comes to self-care and personal wellness, that is another thing that we're going to end off with. How do you take care of yourself best? And how do you consider your personal wellness after caring for somebody else who's been in crisis? So here are some guidelines to follow to be the most effective peer supporter you can be without crossing any boundaries. First thing is no controlled acts of therapy over the phone. We're not doing CBT, psychotherapy, or any other controlled acts that you have to be certified to do. Even if you are a licensed therapist, we're not here providing those interventions during a boots on the ground call. That is something that is saved for your professional life. Here we are acting as peer supporters, and that is it. We are not overstepping that boundary. Stage hogging is another thing that people want to refrain from. Do not stage hog. Do not share your stories to try and add up to theirs. Do not try and relate by just sharing all the crazy things and struggles you've been through, because that takes away from their ability to express themselves and feel heard, and actually feel listened to actively. So remember, the spotlight's on the caller. Allow them to express themselves. Make it about them, that you're actually trying to hear them out and understand their story. Now, if they ask you if you've been through things, or if they open the floor up for you to relate to them, that is when it's appropriate to do so. The next big one is no interrupting. If somebody is sharing a very long story that might be going in circles, it seems, or it seems like they're taking a while to get to their point, it might be that they're in crisis and they're actually struggling with getting the different circuits to line up in their brain. So it's not that that person needs to be coached or pushed or interrupted. That can actually make it worse. When somebody's in crisis, it's very hard for them to express themselves effectively. So they can stutter, they trip over their words, they lose their train of thoughts. So the best thing you can do as a peer supporter is just allow them that space to find their thought, to express themselves effectively, and try not to interrupt them, because that can actually exacerbate the stress response. Now, downplaying and belittling. People do that quite a bit. So do not downplay or belittle somebody's situation. Now, you're going to get a whole cornucopia of different calls coming through, of the different spectrum of severities. You might have some people calling who are immediately suicidal and have had 1,000 different struggles and obstacles that month to deal with. And you might have somebody calling that is just angry that their car won't start in the morning. Now, regardless on how that presents to you on the phone, you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes and what's contributing to that person's struggles that day. So do not downplay or belittle whatever that person's going through, because if they are in enough crisis to call boots on the ground or to call a crisis service, it means it's bad enough for them that they don't feel safe, or that they feel that they're overwhelmed. So whether you wouldn't feel overwhelmed in their situation or not, allow them that respect and dignity that it's okay to be overwhelmed sometimes. No judgment or stigma. That's another big thing I want people to remember, is that we have a predisposition as humans to judge people and to operate with biases and stigmas. So make sure that you're not casting your judgments on people with the words you use, the tone of voice you have, the way you respond to them. People cope, human beings, I should say, cope in a wide variety of ways to stress. So just because you've been through a certain journey and you did not do certain things to cope with your stressors, it doesn't mean that that person is any weaker or any more of a bad person just because they coped a certain way. We all have different biopsychosocial factors, whether they're risk factors or strengths, that help us cope different ways. So try your best to keep that in mind. Do not cast any judgment, and try not to stigmatize people just because we don't know their journey and we don't know their whole story. So if you're feeling yourself getting kind of activated or triggered by something someone is saying, whether it's a certain substance they're using or a behavior that they're having in their regular life, rather than casting judgment and, letting that monster get the best of you, try to just remember we're all humans trying to get through this life at our own pace. So try to reduce that. Also, no advice or opinions. People do not want advice or opinions when they're in crisis. Now, I know that's a fine line, and I know there's different ways you can define advice and opinions. Now, giving someone information and giving somebody reassurance is very different than advice and opinions, because information and reassurance is all about giving somebody facts and normalizing their responses. Advice and opinions is almost sometimes manipulative, and that's putting ideology behind things, and we don't want to do that when we're providing peer support. So no advice, no opinions. And that kind of goes with judgment and stigma. And then finally, follow your confidentiality guidelines. Make sure that we are absolutely confidential with our callers. Now, we do have that clause that, of course, if there's any risk to harm for self or others, we are going to call 911. So that confidentiality policy is very well outlined in your Boots on the Ground manual, so refer to that if needed. The World Health Organization says that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Basically summing that up, health is not just not being sick. Being healthy is having your physical needs met, your psychological needs met, your social needs, and even emotional needs being met, to the sense that you're feeling a general sense of well-being, not just being absent of a diagnosis of a physical disease or illness. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind as well. There's this big picture aspect that goes into our health, and as we're going to see in our next slide, our mental health goes further than just being happy or feeling good. There's going to be a lot more components that we'll talk about. Also, we're going to make sure that during this course, we discuss how your physical, mental, and social health all impact each other, and where our part plays as peer supporters in trying to connect those dots for the people reaching out to us for help. All right, so we'll move on to mental health. The Public Health Agency of Canada says that mental health is the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges that we face. It is a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. So this itself is a very big definition, of course, just looking at it and listening to it. So let's break it down just a little bit. Mental health is the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges we face. So that one right there is the best way to sum it up, just at face value. That if we're unable to enjoy our life and face challenges, it doesn't mean that that person is weak in character per se. It doesn't mean that that person is not doing everything they can to try and better themselves. There are other factors to it. And it could be that they're struggling with physical health, with their mental health, with their social health. And we'll kind of move into that more as the course goes on. It is a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being. So, emotional and spiritual well-being. A sense of well-being does not mean that everything is right, that everything's beautiful, that everything feels great, that I feel wonderful about myself. It's that you also have the ability to know when to check yourself, so to speak, or know when you're actually not performing at your best, or when you have a weakness that needs to be addressed. A positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being means that you can face these challenges, but also face criticism and grow and learn. Going forward, it also says that you respect the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. Culture itself, everyone comes from different cultures, even different families, you can even argue, have different cultural values between each and every other family within, per se, Western culture, Eastern cultures. It doesn't matter. You see, every person has a different way of interpreting their culture. So we have to give everybody that sense of respect and that actual respect that whatever their perceptions are of how they want to live their life, as long as it's not harming anybody else, there's nothing wrong with that. And with equity, the next part there, equity goes a bit further than equality. Equality means everyone gets the same resources. Equity goes a bit further and says that not everybody needs the same resources as each other. Some people have enough resources on their own that they don't need to take more of those resources that can be given to those who need it more. Sort of how trees actually do this, where if a tree is dying, a lot of the trees in the area that are alive will send their nutrients down the root system to that tree that is dying because they don't need all those extra nutrients. They can send it to the one that might need it more. Social justice. That says basically everyone has a voice, interconnections, that we all are able to communicate with each other and feel connected and valued. And then personal dignity, that people have their own autonomy over their body and mind, and that they're able to have the dignity to make their own decisions. So hopefully that helps people a bit, breaking that down. So mental health is not just feeling good, it's being able to face challenges and have an overall sense of well-being. And we will talk about what is the difference between a problem or disorder now. Now we're going to talk about the difference between a mental health problem and a mental health disorder. What we see here, and this is according to Mental Health First Aid Canada, a mental health problem is when there are symptoms present and affecting daily functioning, but it's often situational and transient when the cause of the problem is resolved. These symptoms cause negative impacts on your physical, psychological, social, emotional, legal, or financial well-being. So, how do we break this down and separate the difference between somebody who is going through a depression because they lost a loved one or a job? That might be healthy then to be depressed in those first few days, weeks, or months as you're trying to come to terms with what's happened, trying to figure out what you're going to do about the situation you're in, and getting over the initial shock of the actual loss of job or loved one. So if somebody's depressed because something is going on in their environment that's causing their depression, then we wouldn't consider that a mental health problem. Now, when the symptoms start to impact that person's physical, psychological, social, emotional, legal, or financial well-being, then we can say that their depression is causing a mental health problem. And we will talk in a second about when it becomes a disorder with depression and anxiety and psychosis and bipolar disorder. We will talk about those. But first, we're going to talk about how to know when it's just a problem that person might be going through temporarily, that it could be resolved with just some support and resource stability. So physical, for example, if somebody's going through a depression and it's affecting their ability to sleep or eat food, well, there you go. Sometimes we'll find when we talk about depression, some of the symptoms can actually be GI symptoms and actual physical symptoms that prevent you from having a normal routine with your biological functions. So depression can sometimes affect you physically. It can also lower blood pressure in severe cases and cause other issues we'll talk about later. Anxiety can cause panic attacks. That would be a physical problem right there. That's affecting your physical well-being and psychological. Furthermore, going through a mania during bipolar disorder could affect somebody's social interactions. It could also cause them to be emotionally regulated and have an inability to be able to control their emotions in times where they otherwise would or would like to. Also, for example, if someone's suffering with a psychosis and it's impacting them legally, for example, they are breaking laws and doing things they otherwise wouldn't when they're not going through the psychosis. That would be an example right there of it becoming a problem versus somebody who might have symptoms of psychosis but functions with it day to day and it doesn't impact them in these areas of well-being. Because it is possible to live with depression, to live with anxiety, to live with bipolar disorder, to live with psychosis-related disorders, and it not cause problems on your well-being as long as your supports and needs are met. All right, moving on now to mental health disorders. Where it becomes a mental health disorder is when there's an inability to manage usual life responsibilities that affect physical, mental, social, emotional, legal, and financial well-being. Symptoms and impact on daily life persist for a prolonged period, even in the absence of immediate stressors. These symptoms are going to be chronic and persistent and are going to be diagnosed by a professional before it's considered an official disorder. So those are some things I want to kind of break down now. When we looked at a mental health problem, it'll be when the depression, the anxiety, the psychosis, the different symptoms that are manifesting are going to start impacting that person's ability to function physically, mentally, socially, emotionally, legally, and financially. Where it becomes the disorder is where they have an absolute inability to manage these usual life responsibilities and their chronic and persistent symptoms. The reason why it needs to be diagnosed by a professional is that there are tons of reasons why somebody could be struggling in these areas. For example, somebody could be struggling with the symptoms of what seems to be depression on the surface, but then upon investigation by their family doctor, their blood work shows that they have nutrient deficiencies that are actually causing these symptoms. The same thing can happen with anxiety, where somebody might have issues with their kidneys or with their endocrine system that are causing symptoms that seem like anxiety. And upon further investigation, we see there's actually another reason for this. Also with psychosis, there could be an actual drug-induced cause or a stress-induced cause behind the psychosis that is not related to schizophrenia or other disorders. The way we separate this in the emergency room is when someone's brought in a state of psychosis where the symptoms are making them a risk to themselves or others, the emergency room will put a form on them, known as a Form 1, where they must stay for a certain amount of time. Over this time, they'll be assessed and followed up with to see if the symptoms change. And if it's necessary, they'll be made to stay for another 48 hours, adding up to a total of 72, to make sure that their system is clear of any drugs. And at that point, if their blood work shows there's no drug in their system or that they're clear and the symptoms are still present, then it might warrant a further investigation towards a diagnosis. One way to look at this is that when we consider somebody to be in remission from a mental health disorder, it's when the symptoms are no longer chronic and persistent, impacting their ability to handle the responsibilities in the physical, mental, social, emotional, legal, and financial well-being. This is after investigation into what treatments and interventions work and what supports they're lacking in their biopsychosocial needs. So what is stigma? Stigma can be described as negative attitudes and behavior toward people based on fixed ideas or judgments. This includes fearing and avoiding what we don't understand. And this can lead to societal barriers, poverty, lack of opportunity, racism, as we've seen through history, systemic oppression, sexism, lack of education, lack of resources, and barriers to effective healthcare. Throughout my career as a paramedic, and I'm sure as many of you have seen as first responders, these things come up quite often, unfortunately, in our society and many societies around the world. These are recurring problems for human beings that we must try to overcome. And stigma is one of the biggest barriers for people not receiving the proper care for their mental health problems and disorders, even when they know that they're struggling and actually want to get that help. How do we help overcome this? We have to find inside ourselves those judgments and negative attitudes that we hold, even amongst the populations that we don't typically think about. For example, the homeless and drug-using population, there's a heavy stigma over both of those areas, over both of those populations. I work with both those populations at the safe injection sites in Toronto. And over again, as I try to follow through with case management, advocating for my clients, even sometimes accompanying them to the emergency room during medical problems and complications, I see them faced with that stigma over and over again of being drug users and of being homeless. Sometimes just the staff at the hospital knowing that the person is an IV drug user is enough for them to instantly start treating them differently without even getting to know the person first, or what led them to use drugs or be homeless in the first place. Moving forward with this, there's an actual situation that brings attention to this exact list that we're seeing in front of us. We were called out to the parking lot outside of our safe injection site for a gentleman who was jumped. When we get to him, we recognize quickly he was one of our clients that we regularly see. Upon assessing him, we realized he did have a head injury and did need to be assessed at the hospital for his safety. The problem with this is as soon as we brought to his attention that we'd wanted to call an ambulance and get him checked out at that hospital, he instantly started to deny this, and he was not happy with this. When we asked him why, he told us that every time he goes to that hospital, he's treated with absolute disrespect, racism, and lack of understanding. Now, many people might think, okay, well, maybe he's making this up. No, he's not. I've been to this hospital plenty of times with people of his descent, specifically First Nations descent, and they're still treated with absolute disrespect and with a different lens than many other people in our society today. You see this across many different populations that are marginalized, and it's something we need to draw our attention to. Unfortunately, as first responders, we don't usually get as far of an education with addictions and mental health as other professionals, so it's easy for us to accidentally fall into these stigmas with these fixed judgments and behaviors that we treat people differently when we're not quite understanding where their behaviors are coming from. Hopefully with this course, I can help people overcome that stigma inside themselves by seeing where some of these behaviors come from and related to the biopsychosocial risk factors that are in their life. Many of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, or at least some version of the hierarchy of human needs. What it reflects is the way that our body and mind is designed to work in tandem with our environments to conquer those life challenges and be able to optimally function with a sense of well-being. In order to achieve one's full potential and optimal functioning and ability to problem solve, all basic life needs must be met. The human brain is wired to sense when a need is not being met and diverts its resources to that area of attention. If someone is struggling to cope or unable to reach their full potential, you should investigate what need is not being met so they may move up in this hierarchy. The best way to kind of address that is meeting the person where they're at. Although many of us already understand this concept, it can be easy to lose track of this in times of crisis or when we're faced with a situation we weren't expecting. This is why it's good to go back to basics. Remember, if someone calls into our crisis line, it's nice to always ask them about these needs. Listening to them actively, you'll be able to hear them sometimes tell you exactly where they are in the hierarchy. When providing support to somebody struggling with a mental health problem or disorder, and it's going very well, and there's good flow of communication, there's good understanding of trust and rapport between the two parties, you and the person that you're trying to support. That means that generally their needs are being met and they feel that they're being heard and that you're properly meeting them where they're at in their hierarchy. If you feel that intervention or communication is not going well, sometimes it could either be your communication tactics or it could be that you're not meeting them where they're at. Sometimes you're jumping ahead and not effectively helping them address a need that's further down the hierarchy. For example, if somebody is not feeling safe, it is very difficult for them to have the resources in their mind to be able to feel hopeful and confident about themselves. So first we have to build them up from that safety level up to social connection. And then once they feel that social connection, we can then help work on that self-esteem. Keeping in mind, though, that not everybody flows fluidly through this hierarchy of needs. Some people are wired a little bit differently, and it's easier for them to work through them at different paces. So keep this in mind that each case is different and try to meet the person where they're at. Simplified in front of you here are the 4 main brain regions involved in crisis and stress response. The brainstem, or the reptilian brain, is responsible for the more basic biological functions and nervous system communication. It's also responsible for those reflexes that can save our life when we're under threat of imminent danger, such as physical harm or sometimes even emotional defenses that lie deep below our awareness. Our amygdala then comes into play with the stress response and survival instincts. It releases a whole flood of corticosteroids and hormones that cause a stress reaction. So this includes epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, which seems to be the more difficult one for us to control. Because cortisol and epinephrine, what they do is they start this reflex and biofeedback loop of survival. And what that does is increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, increases oxygenation to certain organs and certain parts of the brain. Blood flow changes to different parts of the brain to provide resources for you to survive that imminent threat. So when somebody's in overwhelming crisis, it's difficult for them to access their logical reasoning, their problem solving, and concentrate on the big picture of what's going on around them. It's also difficult for them to access their short and long-term memory and to become more intuitive with their responses. This causes somebody to become very dysfunctional in their processing of what's going on around them and makes them react more impulsively and more towards anger and defensiveness instead of more logical and more of a problem-solving collaborative approach to the situation. So that's why the brainstem and the amygdala, we have them addressed first. That we're talking about, although we're going from the bottom up, the brainstem being the more quicker to respond to the muscle groups. So that's the one that will react quickly to guarding and quickly to heart rate and blood pressure, things that we don't consciously have to control as human beings. Then the amygdala has the quick response to those survival stress hormones that get us out of a life or death situation. The limbic system we then move up to, the emotional memory, the long and short-term memory and intuitive responses. Now, if somebody has all of the resources for their brainstem and amygdala to be functioning and to be in control, then the limbic system has now the ability to have emotional control, to be able to access all the responses and stimuli coming through the brain and be able to decide what I should react to and what I should plan more and decide what to react to later. So this is where compartmentalizing comes into play. So if you're somebody who's a first responder or in a high-stress profession, you might find that over time you get really good at handling stressful situations. So whereas early in your career, somebody with less experience might become overwhelmed during a very distressing call or a very high-stress challenging call, you'll see the more senior person on scene have a lot more of an emotional control over them because their limbic system has had time to build a tolerance to those stress hormones and be able to gain a control and coping mechanisms to compartmentalize the stressors coming through. So this is why people can't always act with logical reasoning and problem solving when they're under stress. And the problem is when they come to us for help and we end up telling the person to think logically or just, suck it up and just, not worry about it. Well, the problem is when their brainstem and amygdala are active in the survival flight or flight response and they're having all this stress hormones flooding their body, it's very difficult for them to be able to access the resources for their limbic system and neocortex to regulate them and to be able to manage the situation. So it's not their fault for behaving angrily and defensively. It's simply the body not being regulated. So sometimes taking deep breaths, allowing somebody to vent, somebody to go for a walk and come back and, discuss the situation when they're feeling less escalated. These are all really good techniques for somebody to allow access to the neocortex to better solve the problem. In closing this section about the brain, let's go back to the hierarchy of human needs. The brain itself is actually wired and designed to work within this hierarchy of human needs, so that when one need isn't being addressed for your human survival, then you can't move on to the next need until enough resources are sufficiently provided so that the brain can then feel satiated and then move on to that next need. For example, if you're not sleeping, you're not nourished, you don't have physical health in order, the brain can't then focus on comfort, shelter, and threat aversion and feeling control because it's so much more focused on the biological needs that need to be met first. If somebody is being chased by somebody, or there's somebody out for their life, or they don't feel safe in their environment, or they don't have a shelter to sleep in that night, it's very difficult for them to connect with those around them and to want to build relationships and get along with people. Because if their brain is focused on their safety needs and biological needs, how is it going to have the resources to be able to look towards social needs? That's not how the brain is designed. What the brain is designed to do is not move up to that next need until the needs below are met. That's why someone might be stuck in their amygdala and their limbic system and their brainstem with their reactions to a situation due to a mental health distress. So good peer support starts with those first three needs in the hierarchy of human needs and helps build the person up, often ending on that third need, social needs. Once we provided that peer support and affiliation and sense of belonging, that's usually when they begin their journey on how to then heal, in the long term. Going by the way the brain is set up to handle stress and incoming stimuli, we look at the window of tolerance, or the three different arousal zones: distress, eustress, and dysfunction. These are the different ways that we handle stress when it's coming in, or the way that the mind reacts to stress coming in. Eustress is where we want to be at all times when we're handling challenges. Our optimal arousal zone, where we have cognitive flow, we're motivated, we have radical acceptance of our situation, no matter what it is, and increased potential to be able to overcome those challenges to better our situation. Distress, or hyperarousal, is where we're feeling challenged enough or threatened enough that we actually have a sense of fear and anxiety. There is an actual chance that we don't have the resources to overcome this stimuli coming towards us, whether it be an emotional stimuli, a physical stimuli, or something in our environment. There could be a sense of confusion, hopelessness, sadness. People sometimes can react impulsively with anger or other types of emotional distress. Going over to dysfunction, hypoarousal. If we spend enough time in distress or hyperarousal, where we burn out all of our resources, the nervous system can crash and we can fall into states of depression, fatigue and burnout, disconnection from our environment and our biopsychosocial protective factors, and cognitive dysfunction, the inability to use that neocortex and limbic system effectively to maintain control and overcome the challenges that we're facing. So if we can maintain the state of eustress whenever we're being faced with threats and challenges in our environment, we're optimal and we're able to overcome them at the best of our abilities. But there are many biopsychosocial factors as to why someone might be in eustress. For example, if you're a police officer, firefighter, paramedic, corrections officer, or 911 call taker, if you're having a shift that you feel is going really well, that you're in what's called a cognitive flow state, that no matter what challenges you're facing, you're able to learn from, you're able to feel a sense of acceptance of, and increased potential to overcome. That's eustress. That's where you have all the resources. You've had a good sleep. You've been eating well. You're well hydrated. You're feeling connected with your coworkers. Your family is healthy. These things are all adding up to the sense of resource and protective factor that you're going to overcome the challenges you're facing. Distress, well, maybe you didn't get a good sleep, or you're not eating well, or something in your life isn't going well socially. Maybe a family member is sick, or you're in an argument with your spouse at home. There could be so many factors that are making it distressful now for you to face these challenges, where otherwise you would be in eustress. So in distress, you're feeling the fear, anxiety, confusion, the hopelessness, and sometimes a sense of sadness that you're not going to be able to overcome the challenges. So recognizing when you're in distress you're able to come up with coping mechanisms to move back into eustress and identifying where in these biopsychosocial areas of my life is the distress coming from. Now, dysfunction, that's the state we want to do our best to stay away from. And with post-traumatic stress disorder and with compassion fatigue, it's very easy for people to be stuck in a state of dysfunction for months and even years when they're not getting their needs met. So when someone gets the proper therapies, the proper supports, the proper biopsychosocial protective factors put in place, they're able to come out of dysfunction back into the eustress and optimal arousal zone. So when you recognize yourself in prolonged depression, fatigue, and burnout, feeling disconnected, not functioning at your best when you're on duty or answering calls, that might be you entering that state of dysfunction. And we're going to talk about later how all of our symptoms are different. It's best to be able to recognize, is this state of distress or dysfunction coming from a biological reason, from sleep, nutrition, from some type of medical condition or something else? Is it going to be from something mental? Am I going through a psychological dysfunction, some type of mental health disorder, or a substance use problem? Is it coming from my environment or social connections or lack of social connections? Or is there something else, some type of existential or emotional crisis that I'm going through that's unresolved? I like using the anger iceberg as a concept to bring to my attention whenever somebody is, angry at me, or somebody is expressing themselves in an emotional reaction that is threatening or aggressive. Why is the person acting this way, especially if you're coming to help them, for example? If you're a first responder or healthcare worker or a peer supporter and somebody's reaching out for help and they begin to react angrily towards you or aggressive or defensive, why are they acting this way? Is it just a behavior? Well, often not. Usually there's an absolute reason why. And usually that person isn't aware or they're not addressing the true feeling or the true emotion that's lying behind that anger or defensiveness. So if somebody's becoming angry or defensive towards you when you're trying to help them or when you're just in a general conversation with them, think about what's lying below the surface. The Anger Iceberg addresses the fact that icebergs don't just sit with their entire mass above the water. Most of an iceberg actually sinks below the water, and all you're seeing come up above the water is the tip of the iceberg. So if anger is at the tip of the iceberg or defensiveness, what's really lying below the water there that we're not seeing? Pain, fear, confusion, sadness, and hopelessness. These are the main sort of feelings that person could be overwhelmed with. So pain, for example, as a paramedic, there's times I've been called to car accidents where somebody has a broken bone and we try to move them, they scream out with a curse word or tell us to, let go of them or, scream at us angrily in a sense. Of course, they don't really mean this because they think that we're a bad person. It's the fact that they're reacting in pain or from severe pain that is overwhelming them to the sense that anger is the defensive response that the brain is giving them. So usually, in a survival sense, when you're in overwhelming pain because you're being attacked by an animal, becoming angry will give you the resources to be able to defend yourself and fight off that animal. This is something that is so deeply ingrained in the human psyche and in the wiring of our survival instincts that people aren't often able to be aware of this on the surface. So we can point this out to them sometimes. So when someone's cursing at me when I'm trying to take them out of a car accident and they have broken bones, I can say things like, I understand you're in absolute pain right now. I know that you're not mad at me. And that kind of de-escalates the situation a bit. Fear is another one. If somebody is angry at you for not listening to them on the phone, maybe it's because they're afraid that they're not getting through to people and they're not being heard and that they're miscommunicating, because that can create a sense of confusion. And if somebody is extremely confused, they become defensive, because if you're confused, it means you might be missing something and you want to be manipulated or taken advantage of. Sadness. When somebody is feeling profound sadness or loss, sometimes they can become angry or defensive as an emotional response to defend themselves or to survive. Hopelessness is another thing linked to sadness, where if somebody feels absolutely hopeless in their situation, it can overwhelm them and create an absolute boil point of anger and defensiveness and aggression, because the brain feels there's no other sort of resource, there's no other option to survive. So when we're backed into a corner and we're overwhelmed with pain, fear, confusion, sadness, or hopelessness, often anger or defensiveness is the response that occurs. So if we can address which one of these things below the surface or feelings that this anger and defensiveness are coming from, we may be able to better de-escalate the situation. This works just as well when identifying anger and defensiveness in ourselves as well as other people. Think about times that you became extremely defensive or aggressive in an argument. Were you feeling some sense of pain, sadness, hopelessness, confusion? Anything else that was kind of on your mind or going on in your life at the time? Often these things aren't absolutely present on your mind when you're in a survival stress response because your neocortex isn't providing you with the resources to be aware of everything at once. Your brain is only aware of what it needs to be aware of at the time it's surviving. This course is going to go through an ABCD approach to mental health crisis intervention and peer support. First, we're going to want to assess the risk of harm to themselves or other people around them. Are they expressing to you any suicidal ideations? Is there a threat of an overdose? Or any chance that their safety might be threatened or someone else's safety in their environment? After that, we can build connection and understanding. Most relationships, if not all relationships, are built on a level of trust and compassion. Human beings need to be able to trust whether you're going to provide them with a sense of control, comfort, and connection, or whether you're going to threaten their safety and take away one of those things. So by building connection and understanding their situation, we can build trust and rapport to be able to provide the best possible support for their situation. This is the level that we're supposed to spend the most time on. Then we can move on to the next step, connecting them with appropriate resources to better their situation. First, we want to explore what professional resources they've tried and what they're willing to try that are appropriate and accessible to them. This means asking them, what are some things that have helped them in their journey so far? Was it a family doctor? Was it a counselor, a therapist? Was there medication they used to be on that they've come off of? Was there some type of lifestyle changes they used to have that now they've lost sight of or they've lost connection with? Are there social supports they've lost that they used to have that helped them quite a bit? It's also helpful to ask about things that didn't work, things that they wouldn't want to explore again so that we don't cross that path over and over, tiring the person out and burning them out from wanting any type of help. Once we've discussed some of the appropriate resources that they're willing to try or have tried, we can then move on to actually connecting them with them. Maybe seeing if there's a phone number we can help them find, or if we can provide them with a resource that Boots on the Ground has on our list of referrals and resources. Once we've kind of allowed them to have that resource to walk away with, we want to then move on to D, discussing healthy self-care strategies. So although we've built some connection and understanding, we've assessed some risk, we've connected them with maybe a resource or reminded them of a resource they want to try, we now want to ask them, what's something that you can do right now to have an increased sense of well-being? What are some coping strategies that are healthy that you can do tonight to feel better, that you can do when we hang up the phone that's going to make you feel a little better than when you called? So let's not just leave them with a resource to walk away with, but a strategy. And it may not be us telling them something. Ask them simply, what's something that you like to do every day to feel better? Is it playing music? Is it listening to something? Is it going for a walk? Is it exercising? Is it cooking a good meal? Is it getting a nap? Is it talking to somebody that they really like? Ask them and discuss some healthy self-care strategies. Now, it's possible that you have another approach you like to use other than the ABCD approach, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is just a simple guideline for providing peer support and crisis intervention without getting lost or missing any important steps to make sure the person is not at risk, has expressed themselves and feels heard, and has walked away with a resource that is appropriate, and maybe walk away with some self-care strategies or be reminded of some things that can help them feel better immediately in the moment to self-soothe and avoid harmful coping strategies they would otherwise use when they had no other option. When somebody's in crisis or struggling with a mental health problem, it's difficult sometimes to pace ourselves and to hold back a bit and allow time for somebody to work through a problem and support them effectively. Sometimes that can be because our own emotions are being triggered by the situation, or because we're losing our patience, or that we really are having a hard time seeing this person suffer, so we want to just fix the problem. So trying to resist that urge to take control of the situation and just fix the situation, fall back into pacing yourself. So the PACE acronym will start with the P, which is partnership. We have to show the intention that you want to work with the person. We don't want to take control of them and tell them what to do. Oftentimes, people are already aware of what's wrong with their situation. Sometimes they already know the solutions they need to have. It's often just not having the resources. Or if they don't know the solution to their problem, very few people are willing to be told what their solution is for their problem unless they're asking for it. So building partnership with somebody, it's showing an intention that you want to work with them and supporting them with finding the solution to their problem. Autonomy. This is an important one. After we built partnership, we want to focus on giving that person their own control over their own mind, body, and environment. So giving them their autonomy, reinforcing that they can make their own decisions in their life and about their own problems. Because we don't know everything about somebody's life. There's no way we're going to understand every biological factor, every psychological factor, or environmental factors that come into play in somebody's struggles. So when we try to take away someone's autonomy and tell them what to do, again, that's breaching that partnership as well. It takes away their ability to solve their own problem and to be able to exercise that muscle. And also, they're aware of a lot more of the factors than we are. So giving them that respect and dignity that they have their own autonomy will allow them to trust you more and actually be more receptive to assurance and information. Moving on to compassion. Now, once we built partnership, we've reinforced that they have their own autonomy in their situation. It's time to show them compassion. Many people don't get shown compassion very much in our society, and that's not to say that people are doing this on purpose. It's that compassion takes a lot of understanding of human nature. It takes a lot of understanding of yourself and a lot of self-awareness. So treating every human being as if it's you living another life is a very good way to look at that. Because if you're seeing it as a version of you, you want to have respect, dignity, hope for your future. So you're going to want to wish that onto somebody else. And if you also add on the idea that they're living a completely different life with their own experiences that shape their opinions and perspectives and morph their reality and shape the neural pathways in their brain, and they have different genetics, they have all these different factors, biopsychosocial plus, that make them a different version of you. So compassion is seeing other people as a human being and giving them that same respect and dignity. And it's a step further than empathy. Because we have sympathy, where you're kind of disconnected, but kind of feeling sorry for someone. Then we have empathy, where you're feeling with somebody. But that can be quite painful as well, because you're sitting right in there in that moment, and you're activating the pain circuit of empathy in our brains. Whereas compassion goes that extra mile, where it's more understanding and giving people the respect and dignity. And really, understanding that we're all human beings in this together. And then evocation. Once we've built partnership, we've shown them that they have autonomy, and then exhibited some compassion. That allows the person to evoke the best possible solution to their problem. Supporting them in finding their own solution is what we want to do as peer supporters. Like we go back to the idea that we don't want to solve someone's problem for them because we don't know all of their biopsychosocial factors. We want to build partnership, autonomy, compassion, so that we can help them evoke the best possible solution for their problem. So that's how we pace ourselves. And we'll move on to the next acronym. So if you've ever been in a situation where you want to support somebody who's in crisis or struggling with a mental health problem, but they keep shutting down, or you're getting lost and you're not quite sure what to say or where to go with the situation, use your oars to get the conversation moving and to have the person open up better. We start with open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are questions that are not just yes or no answers. Open-ended questions allow people to explore their ideas and to actually give you more information about their situation. A closed-ended question might be something like, how was your day? And they can just say good or bad. An open-ended question would be, can you tell me about your day? That allows them to share more information and explore the idea further with you. If somebody is expressing to you something distressing, instead of saying, well, that sounds really sad, or are you angry about that? Say, well, how do you feel about that? And that will have the person open up a lot more about where those emotions are and their perceptions. So open-ended questions are going to keep that conversation moving. And it's going to prevent them from shutting down and from giving one-word answers that kind of close off the conversation. Then affirmations, the A. Affirmations build trust and rapport, and they help positively reframe the situation. So if someone's telling you about an angry outburst they had at work, where they yelled at a bunch of employees, coworkers, and they were very angry and aggressive, and in a behavior that could actually affect them in losing their job, well, you're not going to say something like, wow, that's terrible that you did that. It sounds like you're really out of control, buddy. No, if someone shares something like that with you, a good affirmation would be something like, well, that sounds like you're pretty angry, or sounds like you're pretty hopeless. Those are affirmations. You're not agreeing with them and saying, yeah, I'd freak out and break things too. That's agreeing. An affirmation is, well, if you're that angry, I can see why you would break something. But let's talk about why you're angry. That's where you're affirming them. So open-ended questions will open them up, provide you with more information about the situation. The affirmations will keep you on their side of building trust and showing that you see them as a human being, and you're normalizing and validating their reaction in crisis. Because as human beings, we all have a breaking point and we all have our own reactions to crisis. So we need to give room for that. Reflective listening. That's the other part, where as the person's sharing their story, you're using your body language, your facial expressions, effectively and carefully to reflect to them some of the things they're saying to you. And sometimes that's even sharing a statement. Like if somebody says, oh, I've just been kicked out of my house, my father just got really sick, and I have to work on the front lines in this pandemic of this COVID-19 thing. It's, wow, it sounds like you're pretty overwhelmed there. I mean, like being kicked out of your house, being on the front lines of a pandemic and having a sick family member, that would be really hard. That's a good way to reflectively listen. So you're not just paraphrasing simply, you're kind of reflecting also the emotion the context of what they're telling you. So it's not just that they got kicked out of their house, the family member's sick, and that they're on the front lines. It's also what that's doing to them. You're showing that you're really understanding what they're saying and how their situation's affecting them. Then we can move on to summarization. After the open-ended questions, some affirmations, reflectively listening, and they feel like they've come to the end of their venting or their story, or they've shared as much as they're able to share with you, then that's a time where you can step in and do a summarization. And that shows your understanding and closes the loop of communication. So don't just repeat to them verbatim the words they used. From your own perspective, summarize what they've just shared with you and check with them there. That's where I always like to tell people. So let me know if I got something wrong. And then I share with them how I'm summarizing. And then at the end of that, I say, so did I miss anything? And that gives them a chance to be able to share anything that they didn't get through to me. So when you feel that the conversation is stopping or you can't open somebody up and you want to be able to provide them support, use your oars to get things going. The final tool that we'll introduce is called DEARS. It's best used with something called change talk, or when we want to reframe somebody's perspectives about their situation. Whenever we need somebody to change a behavior or to change their perspectives about their behavior, this is the best way to have that conversation without pushing them away while still building trust and rapport. One of the trickier things to do is develop discrepancies in somebody's ideas without making them feel judged or stigmatized or become defensive. So if the person is showing a bit of defensiveness, we want to empathetically reflect the contradictions in their ideas. For example, if somebody is about to drive drunk and they don't feel like they're drunk, how do we communicate that to them? For example, we might say, oh, you don't feel like you're drunk? Well, how come you're slurring your words? Or I can smell the alcohol in your breath. Or I can tell that you're off balance when you're reaching for your coat. Things like this are ways that you're kind of showing the mirror on the person's behaviors without overtly saying, hey, you're a liar, or hey, you're wrong. Because when we judge people that way or use sort of accusatory or more aggressive statements, that makes the person shut down, become more defensive. But when we develop discrepancies with more empathy while expressing a sense of compassion or concern for their behavior rather than judgment and contempt. Next, we want to show them that we can express empathy, meeting them on their level as if it was you. So we can go back to that same person who wants to drive home drunk but doesn't think that they're too drunk to drive. Well, you say, I understand you want to get home right now. I understand that you don't feel that you're drunk. But if I was drunk like you were, I would want someone to stop me from driving because I wouldn't want to put somebody at risk. So that's a way you can express empathy, sort of switch it around. What would you do if I was going to put myself or someone at risk? You're a good friend of mine. Wouldn't you want to stop me? Then we want to avoid arguing. Seek to find a collaboration instead of trying to control the person. So if the person starts to push back against you or get defensive or aggressive, instead of arguing with them and trying to beat them, so to speak, back up a little bit and just express, again, the empathy and concern. I don't want to argue with you. I'm just trying to be your friend. I'm just trying to help you out. That's all. And then moving on to rolling with resistance. Validate the lack of readiness to change the behavior. Hey, look, you may not want to let someone drive you home. You may not want to take a taxi and pick your car up in the morning, but I'd rather you make a really good decision. Otherwise, you might have to call the police, because if you put people in danger, we can't let you do that. Then we can move on to support self-efficacy. Reflect to this person that they are the ones that have to make their own decisions about what steps they can take. All right, I can't hold you down and stop you, but I hope that you could second guess this and think about it and decide that maybe you are too drunk to drive from this bar and they should let somebody else take you home instead. So remember, with change talk and reframing with DEERS, we want to develop discrepancies, express empathy, avoid arguing, roll with resistance, and support self-efficacy so that they can be the ones that make their best decision. And remember, if somebody's going to put somebody or themselves at risk, you can always call 911. This diagram here is a very useful tool to bring all the concepts together that this course has to offer. Starting with the top, you can see the different zones of arousal. The hypoarousal with depression, burnout, disconnection, and dysfunction, with the optimal arousal zone at the top, where our brain and our nervous system are operating at their best. Over on the right, the hyperarousal, when we have anxiety, impulsivity, fear and anger, or distress in our decision making. In the green wording there, we see all these different words or different variables and factors that can negatively impact somebody who's experiencing a mental health problem or disorder. In the red there, where those holes seem to be, are the different holes that can be in somebody's healing process. So, for example, their biology. If somebody's struggling with a medical problem or genetic factors or physical health factors that are impacting their ability to cope, that can be a hole that they're falling through in their ability to manage their mental health. Education. If somebody doesn't have access to education, or their education about mental health or about their own symptoms and problems, that might be a hole that they're falling through, and they may not be self-aware of the struggles they're going through and what's available to help pull them out of that hole. Then on the next hole over, we have community. And you can fill in the community hole with something like boots on the ground, with peer support, with family, friends, with workplace initiatives, with community initiatives to help build a sense of family and connectiveness within that community. So that's another thing right there. So these holes can either be holes or we can fill them up, and they can be protective factors in that person's life. For example, if you hook somebody up with a family doctor, or they have a change in their nutrition or their sleep or something with their biology that can help them, that then becomes a protective factor in their coping with their mental health. With education, if they take some self-help courses or they pair with a mental health professional that helps teach them about their situation, or they even take it upon themselves to go to school and learn about mental health, that's another thing that can become a protective factor. And with community, again, getting out there and making friends, building relationships, having peer and social supports, having friends and family who understand them and don't cast judgment and support them in their healing journey. Again, there are plenty of services in that community area that Boots on the Ground has in our resource list that we're able to offer the people who call us. And that's definitely a hole that we can help fill and build for as a protective factor for the callers who need our support. Moving over to healthcare. Well, of course, as we all know, we're as first responders, our healthcare system does have many problems with it. Although it's amazing, there's a lot of problems in regards to addictions and mental health. And I wouldn't say it's the fault on people directly, because I think as human beings and as first responders, we get into this work because we want to help people. Same with any healthcare worker, nurses, doctors, researchers, anyone out there, I believe, wants to get into it for the right reasons. The problem is when the system has cracks in it, for example, especially in the addictions and mental health realm, we see people falling through this hole over and over again. That is why I became an addictions and mental health worker and started working at these safe injection sites, because specifically people with substance use disorders and comorbid mental health disorders often fall through the cracks in our healthcare system because there isn't enough education, there isn't enough ongoing training, there isn't enough, continual reminders of how mental health plays a part into people's behaviors and their barriers to getting care. So if our healthcare system is great where you live, you're going to get the care you need. If your healthcare system in regards to mental health is poor where you live, well, you might fall through that crack over and over. Finally, the final hole on the right there is recovery. If that person's biological needs are met, they're getting all the support they need for their physical health. They have all the education provided to them to make it a protective factor. They have their community supports in place. Their healthcare system is meeting their needs. Then we have to worry about now their recovery needs. What are the final supports, the final factors that we need to think about or that person needs to take care of in order to fully maintain their recovery? Their ability to complete that journey and be in that recovery mode and eventually that remission mode where the mental health disorder or problem is no longer affecting them. So then moving on down, pace, autonomy, compassion, evocation. If all those green factors and variables at the top, the isolation the person might be experiencing, the stigma they're going through, poor nutrition, the family problems they might be experiencing, illness or injury, poor sleep, financial woes, work problems, lack of support, time management issues, racism they might be experiencing in the system, sexism in the system, ageism, something that's going wrong in their environment or toxicity in their environment, mental health wise. Their society might have problems with it where they're living. Social location might be an issue. Stress might be one of the biggest impacts on people's well-being. Their genetics, they might have certain genetic predispositions for depression, psychosis, addiction, other things. They might have a sense of ignorance or naivety towards what they're going through, a lack of self-awareness that they're struggling and might be putting their symptoms out onto other people. They may have an inexperience with something they're dealing with. They may have never come across this problem in their life before, and it's giving them an inability to actually cope or know what to do about it. They might be burning out with their work or with their obligations with their personal life. They might have post-traumatic stress, which is not just in first responders, but many people have a chance of actually having post-traumatic stress from different traumas in their life. Compassion fatigue might be something that's bothering people and making it hard for them to cope. Their relationship problems, trauma, lack of resources, lack of control in their life, crisis, hopelessness, lack of insight, confusion, and lack of safety. You can fill this up with as many factors that you know about through your experience in your life. But if enough of those build up, it pushes the person away from the optimal arousal zone over into the hyperarousal or over into hypoarousal until they fall through the crack through one of these holes you see there. And then we must use partnership, autonomy, compassion to help them evoke their best way to bounce back up and get back to their optimal arousal zone. So if somebody falls into crisis, again, a reminder down below there, they're A, B, C, D. Assess the risk of harm to self or others, build connection and understanding, connect with appropriate resources, whether it's 911, whether it's crisis teams, whether it's a rehab, whether it's a support group, whether it's friends and family who are valuable supports to them, whether it's another community or mental health resource that's effective. Discuss then, before we hang up the phone, healthy self-care options that they can do right away that will make them feel better about their situation. And then below those four pillars to good self-care, physical self-care, mental self-care, emotional and social self-care. Feel free to use this diagram when you're performing an intervention during a phone call or simply to refresh yourself on all the different factors that go into somebody's cognitive functioning and what could lead to a mental health problem or disorder in their life. Many people in their life have experienced depression, at least at some level. It doesn't mean that you've had clinical depression enough to be diagnosed as a disorder, but having a problem with depression in your life is very common when you're going through regular life events that are overwhelming or distressing. For example, if you lose a pet or a family member, or you're going through a job transition, or you feel disconnected from those you care about because of some changes in your life, it's normal to have the symptoms of depression. But then when the problems are addressed and your needs are met, then the symptoms of depression are then relieved. Where it becomes clinical depression is where the symptoms are persistent and chronic and are there even when there's an absence of actual stressors in your life. There are various biopsychosocial factors that can lead to somebody experiencing depression. If we look back to the hierarchy of needs, maybe the first 3 needs on that hierarchy aren't being met. The person's biologically not having their needs met. Maybe they're not sleeping properly. They don't have proper nutrition for their body. They don't have a healthy lifestyle routine that can help their body maintain that homeostasis of proper functioning. And remember, we're all different for that. Exercise has also been major in preventing and treating depression. So maybe somebody has some biological issues that are going wrong, or maybe even a genetic predisposition to depression. They may also be experiencing symptoms of a head injury. There's lots of evidence that people who've had multiple head injuries can go on to have clinical depression because of it. So with that in mind, we're not diagnosing anybody as peer supporters or mental health first aiders. We're simply going to have these things in our awareness when we're having conversations with people so that when they bring them up, we can understand how they play a part. So biologically, there's many factors that can cause depression. Psychologically, someone could be overwhelmed. Somebody could be experiencing things that they're not able to cope with. Maybe there's challenges in their life that they don't feel they're able to meet. So that's another factor. Socially, maybe they're feeling socially disconnected, that their environment isn't providing them the supports they need. So again, back to that hierarchy of human needs. Maybe their biological needs aren't being met, their safety needs aren't being met, and maybe they're not feeling connected. So that's something that we can help them with as peer supporters on the phone, is talk to them about those 3 needs. How are they meeting their biological needs? How are they making themselves feel safe and in control of their mind and body? And then how are they maintaining a connection to their friends and family and even coworkers who provide them effective support? What are some myths and stigmas that actually exist surrounding depression as well? Well, one of the main ones is that it's actually a choice to be depressed, or that people have a weakness or a deficit in character that's making them behave this way. What we know now is that there's actual changes in the brain, changes with neurotransmitters, changes in blood pressure. All these things are factors into how it's not somebody's choice. And everybody experiences depression on a whole different scale. So some people may have a level of depression where they can cope with their daily life. It's just more difficult. Some people might have it so severe that it's so hard for them to get out of bed and function with just basic needs. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, that it's not a character flaw or deficit. There are actually changes in your blood pressure when you're going through depression sometimes, if it's major enough. Sometimes the way the blood flow is in the brain, the ability for the brain to access the problem solving and logical decision making. Remember, back to that diagram of the brain we have, the neocortex. People who are going through major depression, it's shown that there's lack of blood flow to this area. A lot of their blood flows in that survival area in the limbic system, and there's a quieter response. They're in the hypoarousal state. They're usually in that kind of dysfunction, using that fatigue and burnout symptoms, that disconnection and inability to optimally function at their best. So keep in mind, depression is not a choice. There are many factors going into it, and they're different for each person, and it's not a choice for that person to go through it. How does depression affect physical health? Like we just said, there are changes in blood flow in the brain. There's changes in the person's hemodynamics that can happen from depression. Depression is a whole body illness at times. It's in some spectrums, it could be all about psychological symptoms, but other times it could be a lot of physical symptoms. I myself, when I experience depression, most of my symptoms are migraines, fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, inability to put my words together. Things like that come out for me in depression. For others, it could be different. What factors put first responders at risk for depression? You can probably come up with your own factors for this one, a whole list that you all have in your own heads that are in your life and others around you. But I think the main ones we can agree on is disconnection from friends and family. When I moved out to Halifax to work as a paramedic, I was in a whole different province. So I was disconnected from my regular foundation of friends and family in Ontario. And when I made friends in Halifax, sometimes their shifts would be on alternates than mine. So you'd never be able to hang out and spend time together outside of work. So things like that were always putting a strain on my ability to cope, that I felt really disconnected a lot of the times that first year, until I found out how to overcome that and build ways to be able to feel a bit more connected. So that alienation, feeling disconnected, the constant stress of our environment, so the rushes of cortisol and stress hormones can actually cause our body to move into dysfunction. There's also a lot of burnout and fatigue in the healthcare and first response community, not because of a weakness in our character, but because of the high stress nature of our jobs, the shift work, the stress it puts on all of us, and the system itself having various cracks and holes that we're trying to repair and improve daily and yearly in the system. So in the next slide, we're going to go over the signs and symptoms you'll see in depression and that you might see in yourself or others around you when you're providing support. Depression causes the inability to experience pleasure with nearly all activities, along with depressed mood, cognition, and energy. This can lead to problems with biopsychosocial functioning as a result. As we just mentioned in the previous slide, it's a problem when it's linked to something immediately, like a stressor in your life, that when resolved, the signs and symptoms go away and you're able to cope again. It becomes a disorder when the signs and symptoms are chronic and persistent in the absence of those stressors. And it's affecting you physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, legally, financially, all those areas of our life that we consider it now being a mental health disorder. And once again, we are not diagnosing. It's just that we're being aware that if the person has that or they're living with depression, this is what it's causing on their life. There's various approaches to solving this pharmacologically and without medications as well. So with the medications, a lot of them are targeting the serotonin pathways or the norepinephrine pathways, the most common ones we see. So SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Because sometimes in depression, it could be an actual absence or inability for serotonin to maintain its effects in the bloodstream. They prevent serotonin from being sucked back up into the cells and then causing the effects of depression from absence of the serotonin. So what serotonin is supposed to be doing is it tightens blood vessels. It causes that calming, sort of content, sort of happy effects we feel when we're having our needs met. But when somebody has depression, in some cases, that serotonin is not present or it's being sucked up too quickly and they're not able to experience that feeling of pleasure. So for some people, these medications do work, but they don't work for everybody. For some people who are their depression's coming from their environment or from a job that they're not doing well on or a job they don't like, or they're in an abusive relationship, or they're struggling with cancer, yes, maybe these medications could help, but sometimes these medications will do nothing or can even make them feel worse. Because if their problem is not coming from a chemical imbalance, then these medications are inappropriate. And sometimes they may benefit better from talk therapy or other forms of biopsychosocial self-care. So keep in mind, these drugs and medications are not for everybody, but for people who are struggling really profoundly or for a long time and they're trying many things that aren't working, they might be a good thing to try just to see if it works for you. The other ones are TCAs, MAOIs. There's all different types of medications that target different neurotransmitters that might be responsible for depression, but keep in mind that they are not the be-all and end-all, and they do not have an extremely high success rate. Many people can try tons of different medications before they find one that works, or before they realize that none of them are working. But antidepressants have saved many lives and have helped a lot of people get their life back on track. So although you would never suggest somebody goes on these, being aware of what they do and if somebody's tried a bunch in the past could help you in evoking their best response to their situation. Counseling and other therapy approaches like psychotherapy, CBT, and EMDR, emotion-focused therapy, all these different approaches can be effective if their depression is coming from a psychological or even environmental cause. A lot of the times counseling and therapy can be very helpful for somebody in taking control of their symptoms and being self-aware of when their depression is getting out of hand, and then they need to take certain self-care measures. So yes, these are also effective. Meditation and mindfulness approaches, they're very effective. Changes to sleep, nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle routines can also be very effective in helping people combat depression. Medical cannabis is another one that's come out right now that's been a more recent intervention for depression and anxiety. And again, for some people works very well, in others it doesn't. So when it comes to all these interventions that you're hearing about, it's not best practice to recommend them to people at face value, but to encourage people to explore different ones to see what works for them. Overall, when it comes to treating depression or coping with depression, it's about helping the body and mind move away from that hypoarousal dysfunction zone back to that optimal cognitive functioning zone where they can make more rational problem solving, decision making, and have more realistic perspectives about their situation. So however it is that we help them as peer supporters in getting there and using our ABCD approach to help lead them there and pacing ourselves and using our oars as needed. Bipolar disorder can be extremely distressing to live with if it's being unmanaged. The signs and symptoms are going to vary on a spectrum for each individual. Some people might experience the signs and symptoms very mildly to where it doesn't really intrude into their sense of well-being on a regular basis or enough for them to really need help or feel like they need help for it. Other people could be on the very far end of the spectrum where it is very apparently intruding into their ability to function physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, legally, financially, all these other areas. They might end up in the hospital over and over again with episodes of psychosis or self-harm or risky behaviors. They might have a higher risk of addictions and comorbid mental health disorders that might relate. And they're also more at risk for behaviors that are related to the signs and symptoms that are not actually their fault. For example, episodes of impulsivity, which could be either sexual impulsivity, aggression, gambling, substance use, other behaviors that are unlike themselves might become more apparent in the more severe spectrum bipolar disorder. These are the times where they may want to have medication or professional help or at least a support structure that can help them stay on track and cope with these things. Now, the cycling between states of mania and depression can be anywhere from mild to extreme. The phases of remission between cycles are also present. So in bipolar disorder, someone will be cycling between episodes of mania and depression, but will also experience normal moods in between, or what we consider their baseline. And as we said, the shift from this baseline between the mania and the depression can be very subtle for some to where it doesn't warrant any need for intervention, but for others it could shift on such a wide spectrum that they are lacking insight and are unaware of how the behaviors and their experiences are impacting their sense of well-being. So how would shift work or substance use affect bipolar disorder in a first responder? Absolutely, you could see that because of managing the symptoms of fluctuating from that hypoarousal to the hyperarousal state and hoping to get the nervous system into that optimal arousal state, lack of sleep, poor nutrition, and stress are some of the worst things on dysregulating the nervous system and preventing us from being able to maintain that optimal arousal functioning. So with bipolar disorder, you'll see a lot of substance use coming from wishing to alleviate the symptoms. So someone might use something like alcohol or opioids or benzodiazepines or something on the more downer end of the spectrum when they're in a mania, so that it brings them more towards optimal. But then when they're in a depression, they might use stimulants like amphetamines or cocaine or caffeine in high doses to bring themselves up towards the optimal functioning. So unfortunately, with bipolar disorder, the reason why it sometimes coincides with substance use disorders so much is that their nervous system is on a swinging pendulum sometimes between the hypoarousal and the hyperarousal states. So the substance use is their way of trying to self-medicate and stay in that optimal arousal zone. And I've worked with a close partner of mine as a paramedic who would talk to me often and openly about her experiences with bipolar when she was living in dysfunction from it. And now she's many years into remission and is really great in the social services field and mentoring people and helping them with their bipolar disorder. But she always told me about the times where she wasn't self-aware, she wasn't regulated with it, and she wasn't getting treatment, where she was constantly using alcohol and cocaine to balance herself out and try to maintain optimal arousal functioning. But when she found a medication that helped balance her out in that sense, or maintain that sense of optimal well-being and functioning. Also with talk therapies, there was emotion-focused therapy she said helped a lot, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's usually a multidisciplinary approach with a biopsychosocial lens to give the person the best chance at finding what's going to work for their specific situation. Just like depression, bipolar disorder can come from many different causes, so it's best to take a multidisciplinary approach and have the person trying many different things to help cope and different resources to help them regulate and manage their life challenges. And we must remember as peer supporters to have patience and provide that person with bipolar disorder a sense of control, comfort, and connection in our conversations. Because with bipolar disorder, it is not the person's choice to behave impulsively or erratically or defensively. It is often a response in the nervous system or outside of their control and awareness. As you're going to see in the next slide, some of the actual symptoms of bipolar disorder is delusions and lack of insight. So when the person is not in the state of dysfunction, they are often able to be well aware of the harms that their behavior is causing, and they do not wish to cause those harms. So if you're having a conversation with somebody and they're behaving erratically towards you or irritable or what you'd consider to be rude, but you know they're struggling with bipolar disorder, remind yourself that they are not doing this on purpose, and that you're best to provide control, comfort, and connection. Pace yourself, remember, provide partnership, autonomy, compassion, and evoke their best solution to their to their problems. When effective structural supports, education, self-care, and healthy coping are in place, it's very easy for someone with bipolar disorder to live a very functional life where it doesn't intrude on their sense of well-being, where they do not have any dysfunctioning in their physical, social, mental, emotional, legal, or financial well-being at all. The problem is the stigmas that our society and systems put on people who live with bipolar disorder cause their barrier to be able to get the proper treatment and supports to be able to cope with these challenges. Oftentimes, people just need patience, understanding, and a chance to find the proper resources that work for their situation. This is why you'll often never know when somebody's living with bipolar disorder. Usually they found a regimen or routines that have worked for them, and they're no longer experiencing the signs and symptoms that cause them dysfunctioning. The only times that we're really aware of it is when the media perpetuates it negatively, or when there's a situation that we're called to as first responders where the person's needs are not being met in their situation biopsychosocially. So we must be aware of that, especially when providing peer support, that people are trying their best to live their best life despite whatever they're going through. And when given the opportunity, will take the help they need to be able to maintain optimal functioning and give back to their society. Those living with bipolar disorder experience episodes of depression and mania with normal moods in between. These may cycle on a spectrum that varies for each person in length and severity. There are various biopsychosocial factors that contribute to how each individual may cope effectively, and this is why not one shoe fits every foot. Medications, like mood stabilizers and antidepressants, can be effective for bipolar disorder if neurotransmitters and imbalances with chemicals are the primary cause of that person's bipolar disorder. or the signs and symptoms, I should say, because even the diagnosis itself can be quite subjective. For example, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and brain damage, like chronic repetitive brain damage, can have a lot of the same signs and symptoms. Same with lack of sleep, same with certain substance uses or medication changes. A lot of these things can bring on the signs and symptoms as well. And that's why it's not great to just to jump on a diagnosis. And that's why sometimes the DSM-5 and the diagnosis criteria for different mental health disorders can be quite flawed. So that's why it's important that somebody has a multidisciplinary approach, whether it's a family doctor paired with a counselor or a psychiatrist, many people that are on their side trying to help them. And it's also great to have peer support, someone else that they know that has experienced this, that has found their own way through it, or is currently struggling, that they can use as a partner in trying to find their way. So counseling and various therapeutic approaches are very effective. There's emotion-focused therapy, there's dialectical behavior therapy, EMDR, all these different approaches where the person can try and retrain their mind's responses to the signs and symptoms. Also being aware of when they're experiencing their fluctuations between the mania and depression can help them regain control in their life. Lifestyle changes, regulating their sleep, diet, and exercise, and other routines, that can help them with stabilizing and preventing the fluctuations between those arousal zones. The ongoing support from peers, family, and their professional care team. We need to have patience and understanding that this is not a person's choice to be experiencing these signs and symptoms, that there are actual changes in the brain, the mind, and the body, and the nervous system that are causing them to go through these changes, even the changes that are distressing to others, such as impulsivity, erratic behavior, delusions, and the lack of insight. All these things are not their fault. And that's why, as good peer supporters, we need to try our best in conversation to provide them with a sense of control, comfort, and connection. Because just like with depression, with bipolar disorder and other mood-related disorders, that hierarchy of needs needs to be facilitated. For example, their biological needs need to be met, their safety needs need to be met, and their sense of connection and belonging need to be met as well. So then they can move up to their sense of self-awareness and self-esteem and ability to access that neocortex for that nice logical problem solving and ability to meet the challenges that they face in their daily life. Due to the complexity of bipolar disorder, I wanted to make sure that everyone had a good grasp of the signs and symptoms of mania and where they're coming from. The increased energy and activity, that comes from when somebody is suddenly able to do far more than usual, and they appear restless, unable to kind of focus on the same task, and they might be very excessive with multiple activities. It could also come out with an obsession over certain activities. And that comes from changes in the nervous system and blood flow in the brain that causes it to be difficult for them to have insight into this behavior. The elevated or elated mood, the person might feel really charged up, like really happy and high, almost full of that energy, almost invincible feeling. And that's where the delusions sometimes can come in from the inability to be self-aware. The needing less sleep than usual. Someone can go sometimes days with very little sleep or none at all. Can be very fatigued and tired after, but not during this, because with the mania, they're in that hyperarousal state with the nervous system, almost like being on a substance, like a stimulant. And also this person could be on certain medications or substances that could be affecting that as well. Irritability, this occurs if others disagree with them, if they have like these delusions of unrealistic plans or ideas, is also a result of going without proper rest. So like we're all irritable when we don't sleep. Think about the times you've done many night shifts in a row. It makes sense. So if the person's experiencing this hyper arousal for so long, sometimes that can bring on a sense of irritability. Just like if you've ever drank way too much coffee when you're not sleeping very much. That right there is a very good example of a very mild mania or a hypomania that you could be feeling. It doesn't mean you have bipolar disorder. It could just be a problem that you're feeling from caffeine toxicity and lack of sleep. That's why it's good to have a biopsychosocial approach to these symptoms. The rapid thinking and speech. The person may talk too much, too fast, or too loud. They might change the subject or be really distracted, and their thoughts might race. And that's, again, from that hyperarousal state in the nervous system. The lack of inhibitions. They may have very excessive involvement in pleasurable activities that are high risk. like buying lots of things, like a lot of shopping sprees, sexual indiscretions, business investments that you hear about a lot when people are in these manic states. Also, sometimes when people are on cocaine, they'll have that. So these lack of inhibitions come from the disorder itself, and it's not the person actually wanting to behave this way. So when the person gains insight, or when they're properly being managed with these symptoms, or when the symptoms are being managed, they're usually quite embarrassed, and then that depression can be twice as bad when the person is aware of, the way they are behaving in that mania. So we must support them and be very compassionate about this person's behaviors, and that it's causing them a lot of distress. Grandiose delusions. The person may have inflated self-esteem. You can develop supernatural beliefs or superhuman beliefs about themselves or others. There could be a lot of like religious type of symbolism and ideology behind it. Sometimes you hear a lot of people feeling like they are religious figures or that they have certain purposes. You can actually look at the celebrities right now. Kanye West is actually someone who's open about his bipolar disorder. And you could look a lot at his endeavors, in that he does cycle between his mania and depressions a lot, between releasing albums and different business endeavors he goes into, his conversations with Donald Trump. You can see a lot of this interrupting Taylor Swift when she's getting that award. You could see a lot of these different things show up in our celebrities as examples, because sometimes as celebrities are also a good example of where bipolar disorder can fuel creativity and can sometimes fuel the energy to be successful in business. But when these signs and symptoms are causing dysfunction, that's where it becomes the disorder that they need help with. Lack of insight is that final big one that we need to remember with bipolar disorder, that people have a lack of insight into the fact that it's causing them dysfunction, and that's why it's a disorder. When the person has insight, that's usually where it could just be a problem related to another biopsychosocial cause, but they still need that help to be able to gain control over their life. So to wrap everything up, when it comes down to providing support for somebody who has depression or is living with bipolar disorder, we want to make sure that we're keeping in mind that these are common disorders that are out there. They have multiple causes and multiple factors into the severity and to what's going to work when helping the person achieve stability in their life with it. That we must follow that ABCD approach, that when somebody calls, whether it's with signs and symptoms of depression or signs and symptoms of bipolar disorder, we want to start by assessing that risk, making sure that they are not expressing wishes to harm themselves or others. There's no active intoxication or threat of overdose that could put them at risk, or there's no threat to their safety that we can find during our conversation with them. And while building connection and understanding, want to make sure that we remember that relationships are built on trust and compassion, that we want to use our oars to get the conversation moving. Open-ended questions about that person's biopsychosocial factors. Are they having their needs met biologically? Are they having good sleep patterns? Are they eating properly? Are they fulfilling their obligations that they need in their everyday lives? Are they able to cope with the challenges? Are they supported by friends, family members in their workplace, or other services in their community? Affirm them and normalize, validate that what they're going through is often a reaction to their situation, and it's not a character flaw. That's major when it comes down to building that trust and connection and helping that person reach a sense of self-esteem. Reflective listening, super important when somebody's expressing to you a crisis about their depression, to make sure that you're listening to them non-judgmentally and you're reflecting to them what's happening to them and how their situation's impacting their quality of life, and you're showing that you're understanding them. And with bipolar disorder, of course, with reflective listening, reflecting to them the ideas, and then if their ideas are somehow grandiose or not lining up with reality or putting them at some type of risk, making sure you use your DEARs to develop those discrepancies empathetically to help show them that maybe they do need further support. And then summarization. Once you've feel that you've bridged a connection and they feel that they've been heard, summarize what they've just told you, and then move on to that C. That nice connecting them with appropriate resources. When it comes to depression, remember there's tons of different resources out there. Maybe they need a psychologist, a family doctor. Maybe it's group therapy. Maybe it's a support network they can join up with. Maybe it's self-help. Maybe it's mindfulness and exercise. With bipolar disorder, oftentimes it's a multidisciplinary care team. Maybe you can help connect them with a part of their care team that they've lost touch with. Maybe they don't have a family doctor. Maybe they need access to a psychiatrist, or maybe a first responder related support network. And then finally, before we wrap up the phone call with that person with any mood related disorder, we want to discuss what are some healthy self-care activities that they can do that addresses their physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. And these are things that you can suggest for them. These are things that they may already know that we can help them decide what's best. But make sure these are healthy coping mechanisms, and they can address all these areas that can help regulate their mood and avoid burnout. So with yourself, you should make a list, I think. Everyone should have their own list, if you're a first responder or a peer supporter, of a huge list of physical things you can do for self-care, whether it's exercise, meditation, cooking, gardening, something like that that's physical, hiking. Then on your next part of the list is your mental. Under mental, put things like reading, discipline related activities, studying, art, creating things, reading poetry, things like that. When you move on to the social, it's connecting with friends and family. Maybe it's building new relationships. Maybe it's playing video games with people online. Maybe it's doing a Zoom conference with a family member that you never see. Maybe it's going for coffee with a friend, or a social distance walk in the park if it's during COVID times, recommending these things. And the final fourth category is emotional. So after they have physical, mental, and social, make a nice list of emotional well-being activities that we can do, like listening to music, watching emotional movies, playing with cute pets, spending time with kids, whatever it is that helps them feel a sense of well-being that way. So remember the ABCD approach: assess risk, build connection and understanding, connect them with appropriate resources, and then discuss some healthy self-care that they can do immediately when you hang up the phone. Don't forget, never argue with somebody. It's best to roll with resistance, avoid that arguing, and support their self-efficacy, and do your best to be empathetic and compassionate in helping them reach their understanding and what's the best solution to their situation. Now we'll be moving into the topic of suicide. Why is there a stigma surrounding suicide and suicide survivors? Well, one of the main things when it comes to stigma, as we can recall, it's fixed beliefs or judgments surrounding people or behaviors, usually negative, right? So when it comes to this specifically, when many people are faced with the idea of suicide, if they've never been faced with those thoughts themselves, or those ideations and feelings themselves, or they don't relate to it on a personal level or understand it on the level of what's going on in the mind and body and what's causing these behaviors and thoughts, that's going to lead to them having a negative disposition. Because from an outsider's standpoint, if you don't know very much about suicide and the things that lead to it and the different neurological triggers, then it can seem almost like a choice or a decision someone's making. And that's where that negative stigma comes from. It's that negative and lack of education and ignorance towards the topic itself. So the more that we can talk about suicide and how prevalent it is and what leads to suicide, and that it is actually a normal human mechanism in the brain when overwhelmed with profound hopelessness, pain, and suffering, that is where we see more of a reduction in stigma, that we can relate to the fact that it is possible for human beings to feel suicidal, have these thoughts and ideations, but they are coming from somewhere concrete that is rooted in profound hopelessness, suffering, and disconnection. And as a supporter or just someone in your community, to help normalize the conversations about suicide and show that you don't see it with judgments or negative bias, that will allow more people to open up and talk about their thoughts and struggles and be able to avoid feeling alienated and disconnected, which puts people way more at risk at actually going through with these thoughts. So why is it important to normalize the conversation? We sort of just talked about that right there. But at the same point, how prevalent it is. It's the 9th leading cause of death right now in Canada. And amongst youth, that's aged about 15 to 24, it is the 2nd leading cause of death. So this is major. And with the opioid crisis kind of coming to a head right now, we're seeing that there's a lot of crossover and there's a lot of suicides that are being called other things or that are being sort of missed. In the mix of diagnoses and coroner decisions. So there are times that suicides are called something else, and they actually should be added to the statistics of a suicide death. So right now, I think the statistics around suicide in North America is inaccurate, and that could be sometimes due to the facts that families will report deaths of suicide as like asphyxiation or death by overdose or death by cardiac arrest, because they don't want the shame to fall onto that person if that society or community they live in does not see suicide without that negative bias. Also, religion plays a part into that in some areas, like in Prince Edward Island. There might be a higher rate of people reporting suicide as something else due to the religious connotation of dying by suicide. So there's all these reasons of why it might be skewed, and that we need to more normalize the conversation because it is so common, and it is a rising and leading cause of death in Canada. So it's very important to normalize it, to reduce the stigmas so people can face these challenges more head on and actually reach out and not feel as alienated and disconnected when going through these struggles. Because the real truth is, as we've already acknowledged, feeling suicidal is not a character flaw or weakness. It is a response to feeling profound hopelessness, pain, and suffering that does not seem to have an end in sight, or that will just continue to get worse for that person. So for us to be able to connect with them, normalize it, validate that it is a regular response to their situation, that actually helps the person not feel like it's their last resort and that there might be a way out of it, because people are talking about it so openly, and that there are ways to get through it and there is help available. In the language, the next question, why is language important when talking to someone experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideations? If we say words like committing suicide or failed a suicide attempt, these things have negative underlying connotations, and to someone in crisis, if we're using these words, people are more sensitive to wording, body language, and patterns when they're in crisis, more so than we would be in regular conversation. So normally when you're using these words, if it triggers somebody and they're not in crisis, they can process it and work through it, but someone in crisis will take that a lot more to heart, and it can actually manipulate them under the surface without us meaning to. So the language that's best to use is, instead of saying someone's committing suicide, it's they've died by suicide or had an act of suicide. And if somebody has survived a suicidal act, that's the term we should use instead of they failed an attempt or they didn't succeed, because that puts a negative connotation that they should try again, or that there's a challenge, or that they actually, failed, or they're a failure. The idea is they survived, that there is this mechanism that was so strong inside of them, pushing them towards something that they were able to overcome. They survived an act of suicide. And if somebody did die from an act of suicide, they died by suicide is the best way to say it. To take away that negative stigma that actually helps people get better help. The more we stigmatize suicide, it doesn't make people not want to do it, because that goes against the biology of what's going on in the neurology, that it's not a choice, it's an impulsive act that comes out in times of absolute crisis and hopelessness. So what role does honesty and tactful phrasing play in building trust? Well, we just talked a bit about that there, but the more that we talk about it non-judgmentally, that it's a normal human response to stress and crisis that feels hopeless, that it's not a character flaw or weakness, that there's help available, and that many people, many Canadians, many first responders go through suicidal ideations and times where they're faced with this, and that we can recognize it and help them move through it. Also, building up that person's community around them of friends and family members that understand and normalize the conversations will also help them in the long run. Now let's talk about engaging somebody in the conversation around suicide and suicidal ideations. How do we start the conversation with somebody in a way that makes them not feel like they're being scrutinized or stigmatized? And then how do we help move through that conversation and navigate it effectively with tact and discretion to help build that trust with that person and allow them to open up to us, to explain their situation more, so we can help connect them with the appropriate resources to keep them safe. So let's start with how to ask about suicide. If you're sensing an invitation or a red flag, we want to ask. So if you've taken the assist course, which many of you have or are about to do, you'll remember that the assist course is very carefully geared around a structure about understanding suicide and where the thoughts are coming from, and then moving through a conversation with somebody to help them be safe and to regain that sense of hope for the future. So with the assist training, they always go into exploring the invitations early. So if somebody is expressing actions that show that they might be feeling suicidal, so giving away possessions, withdrawing from friends and family, loss of interest in regular things that bring them joy in life, misusing drugs and alcohol, especially where it's changed away from their normal pattern of use, impulsive and reckless behaviors that is abnormal for the person's normal baseline, self-mutilation and self-harm that's increasing, or that is becoming more and more dangerous. So not just surface cutting, maybe they're going deeper or they're going in different parts of the body that are more harmful. Extreme behavior changes is another one, where somebody is now having lack of that emotional control or in that injured or ill phase of their mental health continuum. In the physical way, the invitations you might see there is a lack of interest in their appearance, where somebody normally takes pride in their appearance or is on top of their hygiene, and their organization is now looking extremely disheveled or, once again, different from their baseline. Change and loss of sex interest, that's huge. So if you have a partner that you're living with, or a spouse or someone that you've noticed this with, that might be a sign you work on. Disturbed sleep, that's another thing where someone's sleep patterns are now thrown off completely. Changes of loss in weight, appetite, and physical health complaints. So like physical health complaints that are sometimes psychosomatic or are coming from like problems with the nervous system or GI system a lot of the time. Words. So they're saying, there's the more important thing too. When you're having conversations with people and you're engaging them in an intervention or helping them with a crisis, listen for these phrases that might point you towards an invitation to talk about suicide. And here are the phrases that we get from the assist course. All my problems will be over soon. Someone's saying that to you. You want to explore that. Well, what do you mean by that? How will they be over? No one can do anything to help me now. That's another phrase they might say. And then what you might answer to that is, well, then what might you do about that? Or what do you think your next steps would be? And tell me more about that. Another phrase you might hear someone say to you, I can't take it anymore. I'm a burden to everyone. I can't do anything right. I just can't think straight anymore. So these are all these statements people might be throwing out to you. And what they're doing is they're showing no expression of any future, no hopefulness. They're maybe referring a lot to the past, talking a lot about death, a lot of not being around, about how it'd be better off if they weren't existing. You know, phrases like this, we often can throw away and just pass them off as turn of phrases or just like, you know, phrases someone's using to be poetic. But no, people are often crying for help here and they're asking for that help. But they're in crisis, so they're not able to word it in the sense of just directly asking you for your help. They're saying it in ways like this. So listen for them expressing those feelings of being desperate, angry, guilty, you know, worthless, lonely, sad, hopeless, and helpless, you know, and again, not expressing that they want to be around for that future. Any sense of these things that you're picking up on, ask about suicide and ask directly. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Do you want to die? Are you going to kill yourself today? These are direct ways to ask it, and asking directly will help the person and feeling more recognized and that they're more supported and that you're actually seeing what's going on and you're paying attention to them and you're listening to them. That's what that shows. It does not push the person to actually go through with an act of suicide just because you asked about it. That is not true, and you're actually helping them more than anything. So do you want to die right now? Are you thinking about ending your life? Are you going to kill yourself? Are you thinking of suicide? Those are the best ways to ask it. Do not beat around the bush, or it shows that maybe you are not comfortable with the conversation, right? So show confidence and comfortability. And suicidal thoughts are common amongst many mental health disorders that are chronic and leave someone feeling suffering without effective treatments available, especially if they tried many things. And it does not mean that everyone's struggling with a problem or disorder is at risk, but keep in mind that first responders do have a very high risk of suicide because post-traumatic stress disorder has very few effective treatments, and people go on struggling a long way with it, like a long time, for decades sometimes. They lose families. They can lose their job. There's many things to this, right, that can lead someone to feeling suicidal. So just remember that it's common, and we should do our best to feel comfortable with it, that the more we connect with people, the less likely they are to go through with it. And those who are suicidal, remember, they don't wish to die. It's an act of desperation done out of hopelessness to end pain and suffering. So let's talk more about that with the person. First, once we address that they're willing to die, let's talk more about how it's more about the pain and suffering. And that is the idea. They don't want to die. Even people who've jumped off of the Golden Gate Bridge, I remember that being brought up in the assist course. that many of them who survived said as soon as they let go of the railing, they wish they didn't. And that's the idea. It's that leading up to the act of suicide, they're hit with crisis after crisis and hopelessness, loneliness, anger, guilt, and desperation that accumulates into this impulsive act that the person themselves does not wish to go through. And if only somebody could reach out to them and say that I see that you're feeling this way, and it's normal to feel that way when you're overwhelmed, the person then feels more comfortable connecting with you. And then once that person feels connected and their story is effectively heard, then you can go on to asking more about a plan and the means, right? Don't just jump to saying, well, what's your plan? First, connect with them and talk about their story. Find out exactly what's led them here. Actively listen to them and understand what led them to feeling suicidal. And listen for where that pain and suffering is coming from. Use your pace, your partnership, autonomy, compassion, to evoke their story, and then use your oars to keep things moving if they're shutting down or if you want to open up their story more. Remember, open-ended questions about their situation. Affirmations to normalize this response and reflectively listen and then summarize their story. And once you feel like the story's really been shared and they feel that they've been heard, then you can move on to asking them about what's their plan and what are their means to going through with this act so that we can help distance them from that. So after they've explored some strengths and connections in their life, let's start collaborating on those strengths and connections that they share with us to help build a safety plan. So they have to be, I think, in charge of it, or at least partially in charge of that safety plan, because otherwise people will pull away. Because they're in crisis, we need to give somebody the sense of control in their life. If we just take control away and say, we're going to set up a plan for you that's going to make you better, that actually can push somebody away more. So we want to make the conversation more about, well, how can we help you keep safe? If somebody wants to take pills, well, how do we distance you from those pills so that when you're feeling impulsive and no one's around to listen, you can't just reach for those pills quickly and take them? If somebody wants to use a weapon like a gun, well, then how do we keep that gun away from them so that there's as many obstacles in their way to that gun that in an impulsive act, it takes too long for them to get to it, that it can't be impulsive? One example I have that I think worked really well is I was contacted by a friend from high school who realized that I was in the mental health field now and worked as a paramedic and felt comfortable asking me about what to do. She's a single mother. She has children, 2 children of her own, and the father is refusing to pay any child support, and he's hiding behind his family who's trying to help him battle this legally. Very difficult for her, and she's left with a serving job to try and pick up the pieces, and her family's doing everything they can to help support her and these kids. But she struggles with bipolar disorder, and she has trauma that she's accumulated through her life. It's a very difficult life. And now being a young single mother, that's even harder. So she's been getting thoughts of suicide and hopelessness. And yes, she's been getting all the help she can from, mental health professionals, support from her family. She's on medications. But still, these thoughts will come in. So we talked about it, and she said that her biggest fear was taking pills in an act of desperation. And she had access to the pills, but she had locked them in her closet. I thought, that's a wonderful idea. But I asked her, where'd you put the key? She said, well, the key's in my kitchen drawer. And then I asked her, well, how quickly, if you're feeling really impulsive, how quickly can you grab that key, unlock the closet, and grab the pills? And she said, well, I can get them pretty quick. So that's when I said, well, how would you feel? See, you want to be careful how you word this. How would you feel about giving that key to your mother so that those pills are still in your possession, they're still yours, but you can't access them impulsively? Because if you call your mother asking for the key to that drawer, asking for the key to that closet, your mom will not give you that key. She will talk to you, and she'll know right then and there how horrible you're feeling. So we sat for a bit, and I said, think about that. It's up to you. You have to feel comfortable with this. And she looked at me and she said, you know what? I'm going to try that. I'm going to give my mother the key. I think my mom would be comfortable with that. She knows I'm feeling this way. And that way, knowing the pills are in my closet and that they're still mine, I have that control. I have that control. And that's the thing. When you're feeling desperate, lonely, and hopeless, you need some sense of control in your environment and in your body, some sense of autonomy you have to feel to be human. So that's what we were able to afford her. So after exploring the conversation, seeing the invitations and red flags, I asked how she's feeling, if she was feeling suicidal. We then connected. We explored, her strengths and her weaknesses and the things that she has in her life to make her supported. We then connected with her story. She told me all about her traumas. I actively listened, and then we talked about her safety plan. We built a safety plan together, and then she felt comfortable, and I felt comfortable. And when we left, she didn't have any, she had a plan, right, to take the pills, but she did not have the means to access those pills anymore, and she did not have the intention to die. So we were able to leave that conversation, and I was able to follow up with her regularly with other conversations, and she continued to get help. And at this point now, she's no longer struggling, and she's doing a blog on Instagram for single mothers on how to stay mentally healthy. So you can see how just simply validating for that person and putting yourself out there as someone who sees suicide as a normal reaction for a human being who's feeling overwhelmed, that will have people more comfortable to reach out to you and be open with you about it. And then you can help explore those safety plans to keep them safe. So please use that assist course, because that was a wonderful course. I still use the workbook I read through regularly. And just remember these key points: that the risk of suicide increases when an individual lacks support from family, friends, their community and coworkers. Suicidal thoughts can be common amongst mental health disorders that become chronic and leave you suffering without any treatments left available. And those who are suicidal often do not wish to die. It's an impulsive act of desperation to end overwhelming pain, hopelessness, and suffering. And that could be physical or psychological suffering. So remember your ABCD. In that A, you're assessing the risk, right? So when they're showing you these red flags, we're going to try to ask right there, are you thinking of suicide? Are you going to kill yourself? Go through this nice protocol here that the assist program built and that we're referring to. Once you explore that they have a plan and maybe a means, how do we build a safety plan to distance them from that means? And then if you and them both feel safe that they are not at risk of dying that night or having an active suicide that night, and they maybe have some supports available, and you do your own risk assessment there, then you can move on to the B, building connection understanding, connecting with appropriate resources, and then discussing healthy self-care. And at any point, if there's a risk that they're going to go through with that act that night or that day or right then you should be calling 911 and explaining to them why. And we're all going to be different on our judgments for that, but trust that gut feeling that if somebody has a plan, a means, and an intention that they're going to die right now. Remember the story I shared. She had the plan and the means, but she didn't have the intention. She didn't want to die that night. But if she said to me, I'm going to do it tonight, then I would have to have called 911 or a crisis team for her. And those are very viable options to save someone's life. Because if they're already at the intention to die, they have the plan, the means, and the intention. And let's throw on also that they may have had a prior act of suicide in the past, or prior self-harm, or prolonged feelings of suicide. Then those are more times to go, maybe the plan and the means is enough to call a crisis team and 911. But pay attention to that assist course, review your workbooks, and hopefully this is a nice refresher guide for how to navigate the conversation surrounding suicide by normalizing it, connecting it, meeting people where they're at, helping explore a safety plan that they're collaborating on, connecting them with those wonderful supports and healthy coping mechanisms, helping them stay away from coping with drugs and alcohol, and then assisting them with that plan for life, that safety plan, and then making sure that they and you feel safe before the conversation ends. Much like depression, anxiety responses and anxiety disorders come from actual survival processes in the brain that are supposed to be there to alert us to threats in our environment to help us cope, adapt, and survive. Unfortunately, the stress response is so powerful and so hardwired deep into the brain, it's below our level of awareness a lot of the time. Also to the way that the stress response influences our biomechanisms. When your stress response is highly active, all those resources that are usually diverted towards the neocortex and other parts of the brain that help us with logical reasoning and problem solving, concentration, decision making, and control of our impulses, a lot of those resources are now diverted into the limbic system and amygdala, where that emotional memory is, where that stress response and survival instincts. So it's not that you can't think clearly when you're having a stress response. It's that your ability to cope and have tolerance for that stress response allows your resources in the mind and body to be able to divert to those areas to cope with it. But when the stress response is overwhelming to the point that the resources are diverted to that survival instincts, to where the neocortex is not as effectively accessed, that is where that stress response renders us incapacitated or often dysfunctional. So being simply distressed and having stress or anxiety in a situation that we're challenged in is not inherently unhealthy or unnatural. That is normal, and that helps us rise to the challenge. But when that stress response moves us away from hyperarousal or out of that optimal functioning into dysfunction or distress, that's when the stress response is now unhealthy. So anytime through our careers that we are challenged during a call we're responding to, an emergency, or someone we're helping, that stress response is there to help us perform at our best. It is actually a good thing. It helps us remain optimal. But when we're pushed to our limits or overwhelmed, that then can sometimes move us into territory to be at risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, social anxiety disorder, and panic disorders. We will mention post-traumatic stress disorder in more detail later on, so I will leave that and move on to more of anxiety disorder right now. Anxiety disorder is when you're having that stress response show up where it's not during immediate stressors, where you're not under immediate threat, and it's at the point where you're not able to perform optimally to meet the challenges and coping in your daily life. So it's normal to have anxiety when you're being challenged or threatened, but when it's persistent and chronic, in the absence of stressors, and it's affecting your ability to cope with your challenges in daily life, that is when it becomes an anxiety disorder. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Social anxiety disorder is when you're having this come up and when the symptoms are present more so in social situations, or where you're triggered in situations that are socially related. Panic attack disorder is when it's even further than that, where the stress response becomes so overwhelming that you're having panic attacks, where you're having almost a complete shutdown of the body, where the nervous system is so overactive in the stress response, where now you're having difficulty breathing, you're having difficulty with concentrating, and it is so hard on the body that over time you can have absolute, physiological risk factors for heart disease, for strokes, for many other problems because of the releases of cortisol and the effects on our nervous system. Also, many people can end up in the hospital with panic attacks because breathing to the point of passing out or feeling so unsafe that they can't turn off the response, that can be very debilitating for many people. So it's important to understand that there's a difference between the stress response itself and then these disorders like post-traumatic stress, anxiety disorders, social anxiety disorder, panic attack disorders, and other anxiety-related disorders. The most common symptoms that we see can be separated into physical and psychological symptoms. Chest pain, palpitations of the heart, flushing of the skin, shortness of breath, dizziness, headache, vertigo, numbness and tingling, dry mouth, nausea, restlessness, chronic pain, tension, diarrhea, sweating, fatigue, feeling of choking, and more. What's bringing on all these physical symptoms, and why is it that with a mental health disorder, we're having such a physical effect on the body and there's such a biological component to it? Well, as we're entering this stress response, we're having this major release of cortisol, adrenaline, or epinephrine, as we call it here in Canada, and norepinephrine, and several other processes happening in the body and with the kidneys, with the lungs, the heart, and the brain, all all in conjunction with this survival response to try and keep you alive and have your body prepared to survive, whether that is fight, flight, freeze, attach, cry, or submit. Now, the fight response itself is preparing your body to be able to handle the task at hand or the challenge, to be able to face up to it and be defensive to try and survive that way. Now, that's not the only response. We only receive that fight response if we are programmed it in that exact context. Now, you might be programmed to have a fight response when somebody tries to challenge you to a bar fight, but maybe you have a flight response when somebody tries to jump you and they're holding a knife. See, different contexts are going to bring up different responses inside all of us. And that's going to depend on several factors. Our upbringing, our genetic predispositions, our training, and also other ways that we're exposed to stress and how we integrate that into our well-being. So the fight response is there for you to fight back and survive. The flight response is that you feel so overwhelmed that you must run away to survive. The freeze response is that your nervous system is so overwhelmed by the situation and all these other factors that you hit that state of dysfunction where you're just stuck, frozen, shut down. The attached cry is one that we're born with. So when babies cry, when the parents leave the room, and then until the parents come in to soothe them, that's an attached cry response. So instead of fighting, running away, or just shutting down, we plead for safety, sometimes from the attacker themselves, or from whatever that, parental or mentor figure is at the time. And then submitting. That's the one that saves us and allows us to hit that state of perfect optimal flow. It's almost a sort of a radical acceptance. So when we're hit with an overwhelming, stressful situation, the neurological response to submit to the situation doesn't mean giving up. It means welcoming the situation and the challenge at hand, sort of embracing the moment and doing whatever you can with those resources afforded to you to make the best possible decision out of it without just panicking and becoming impulsive. So the fight, flight, and freeze responses, they're more impulsive responses to stress. And they're ones that are built in to help you survive right in the moment when your life is being threatened. But the attach, cry, and submit responses, they're a bit more contextual to the situation and depends on your training. So we're all trained to submit in situations of chaos so we can do the best for our patients or the people we're responding to so that we don't panic and make impulsive decisions. Part of the submitting is that we're not overwhelmed. So the physical symptoms that we're talking about here. So I guess to summarize the physical symptoms, all these symptoms you're seeing here are coming from that massive response in the mind and body that's affecting the nervous system, that's affecting the chemicals in our body, the electrical output in the brain, and the activity in different neurological structures. Again, when you look at that model of the brain, you can see again with the brain structures how our brain's set up to handle these stress responses. So remember, when you're seeing or you're feeling these physical symptoms, paying attention that it might not be a physical problem they're having. It could actually be symptoms of anxiety disorders. And yes, people do have problems with all body systems when it comes to anxiety. The psychological symptoms, the impending doom, excessive inappropriate worry, the fear of losing your mind, the attention, concentration problems, unreal or unfamiliar feelings, feeling detached from your environment or yourself, the speeding or slowing of thoughts so that they're hard to grasp, insomnia, vivid dreams, and being easily distracted. So separated from the physical symptoms, while all those responses and processes are happening in the body to help us survive, psychologically, the diversion of resources in the brain to those more vital structures and the responses happening are causing all these psychological symptoms. So you're not choosing to have these fears, the attention problems, the concentration issues, feeling detached. You're not choosing that, but it's happening to you. And training somebody or having somebody find the right resources to be able to recognize these physical and psychological symptoms in themselves and learn coping mechanisms to overcome them, that's their best chance at being able to learn to live with or work through an anxiety disorder. So keep in mind that the physical and psychological symptoms are real in anxiety disorders and that people should be made to feel normalized and affirmed that these are responses inside their body that are normal when faced with overwhelming stress. So let's work through helping people assessing their risk of a panic attack. If they can we can help talk them through or breathe through it. Moving on to building connection understanding with B, then connecting them with the appropriate resources for their anxiety disorder, and then discussing healthy self-care for an anxiety attack or anxiety symptoms. So make sure you remember that anxiety disorders and the symptoms of anxiety come from many biological factors, psychological factors. It can be coming from their environment. It can be coming from like a job or relationship they're feeling trapped in, or an unsafe environment. It could be coming from their resources not being there. Remember, if you look at our biopsychosocial model I was showing you earlier with that hypo-arousal zone, the optimal arousal zone, you can see there all those different stresses in their life that could be impacting them. And it could be coming from many aspects of their life, not just their ability to cope. So remember to remind the person it's not a weakness in character. It is a normal response, and that it's about finding which factor of their life, biopsychosocially, it could be coming from and where it's rooted, and getting them the right resources to be able to feel stable and work through that disorder. And you'll see a slide below here where we're going to talk about, or you can read through, the more common causes of psychological crisis that have been identified as Baldwin's factors of psychological crisis. Now let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or as some like to call it, post-traumatic stress, and differentiating it between an acute stress reaction that is normal for that situation and when it becomes a chronic and persistent disorder that is now affecting your ability to cope with your regular daily challenges and ability to achieve a quality of life. Overwhelming stress that causes cognitive dissonance is what oftentimes can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And what that cognitive dissonance is when the brain is so overwhelmed by the situation that it causes this sort of severance between the mind and body, where now you're not experiencing the situation as grounded and as present as needed to process it effectively. You're almost experiencing it from an outside point of view, or your brain is diverting the resources to a place where you're feeling disconnected. And that disconnection is what can lead to that long-term hardwiring of the brain to have post-traumatic stress disorder. And that rewiring of the brain for the fight or flight reaction can then come up in situations that are not immediately life-threatening and can cause major biopsychosocial breakdowns in your ability to have a sense of well-being in daily life. And it can come from accumulated traumatic experiences that go unresolved, or one major situation that has overwhelmed you so much that it's caused this response. And the difference between post-traumatic stress and an acute stress reaction is sort of that same difference between a problem and a disorder. An acute stress reaction can become a problem because you're having all the same signs and symptoms of anxiety-related disorders or post-traumatic stress, but it's in response to an immediate stressor situation, or can be happening sometimes weeks or a month or so right after a traumatic experience. But if those symptoms are going on and persisting chronically and longer than that month or two, that is when it can sometimes be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. It's common to have the symptoms of an acute stress reaction for time after you've had a traumatic experience, but when it becomes chronic and persistent, that's when it is then classified as a post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of us as first responders, I would say all of us go through acute stress reactions regularly with our careers. It's that not all of us will go on to have post-traumatic stress disorder because there are so many factors that could be attributing to it. Now, if you turn your attention to the Boots on the Ground 3rd edition manual, you'll see on page 13 from the pshsa.ca website that explains post-traumatic stress disorder very well. And the excerpt they have there says that PTSD is a mental health condition caused by witnessing or experiencing actual or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. Being affected by these types of events is normal. However, if the thoughts or memories of these events start to seriously affect the life of the person long after the event, that person could be experiencing PTSD. Now, it goes on a little further into the symptoms, but we'll talk about that separately. And it says just below that, it is believed that PTSD is caused by a complex mix of life experiences, including the amount and severity of trauma you've experienced since early childhood, the way your brain regulates the chemicals and hormones your body releases in responses to stress, and inherited mental health risks, such as increased risk of anxiety or depression, and inherited aspects of your personality or temperament. So let's break that down nice and easy. It says here that post-traumatic stress disorder has factors that are biologically rooted, sometimes in your genetics, sometimes in your homeostasis, your sleep, your nutrition, other medical conditions like brain damage sometimes specifically, or other completely unrelated medical conditions. Psychologically, you can have predispositions like outside stressors that are affecting you outside the incident, like you're going through a job change or a breakup or other major crises in your life. It could be pre-existing mental health conditions that you have, like depression or anxiety. And also the way our brains respond to it. And that could be the way that we're set up from birth. It could be genetics. It could be the way our brain's been wired to respond to these situations from early childhood onwards. There are so many different ways that, different variables towards post-traumatic stress disorder. And the final one people don't consider is that lack of support and connection in your community, family, and workplace. So many first responders, if you're starting to go through signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, they might alienate and sort of isolate themselves a bit to not be putting those symptoms on other people, or to also not feel embarrassed or scrutinized or even stigmatized for having this response. So the earlier we catch on to our signs and symptoms and how it's manifesting in our body, and we recognize and help remind the person that we're providing support to that there's many factors to post-traumatic stress disorder that are not to do with a character weakness or deficit or a choice. There are biological factors, psychological, sociological, and several other factors that are out of our control that cause post-traumatic stress. What's in our control is our ability to educate ourselves, our ability to build our resources up, and our ability to recognize our signs and symptoms and when to get that help that we need. Quickly here, we'll just say the main risk factors for developing PTSD also started on that page 13 in the manual. People are more at risk for developing PTSD if they have a job that increases their likelihood of exposure to traumatic events. They experience intense or long-lasting trauma. And right now during COVID-19, I think a lot of people are at risk that aren't even in high-risk professions, just inherently through the process of a global pandemic. Feeling of horror, helplessness, or extreme fear. Seeing people get killed or hurt. Experienced other trauma earlier in life, including childhood abuse or neglect. That is another major component. And Dr. Gabor Mate has said that in any person experiencing PTSD, you can usually find some element of abuse or neglect in their childhood that may have even been outside their control. Another thing they say here, have other medical problems like anxiety or depression. That's a high risk factor. Lack of good support system of family or friends. So if we can be addressing these risk factors and helping the person who's calling us for support, helping them build up protective factors to outweigh these risk factors, that can help them cope better with their struggles. And the final ones they mention, dealing with extra stress after an event. So maybe you've done a traumatic call as a police officer, a firefighter, a paramedic, a corrections officer, a dispatcher, a call taker, right? You've done a very serious call, but then when you go home, you find out that your loved one wants to leave you, or that your child is sick, or that a parent that you have is going through a medical problem that you just realized. See, there's things outside of the job that can be impacting our risk factors of PTSD as well. And then finally, having genetic risk factors, real blood relatives that have mental health problems or PTSD. And of course, remember, military, police, corrections, firefighters, paramedics, other first responders and nurses have such a high prevalence. And in Canada, we have that chart there that says on page 14, I believe, that you see all the different percentages of prevalence among the different first response occupations. So read that. I think it's great to read page 13, 14, even 15 in that manual. And then the page 16 talks about when to see a doctor, and there's a great helpful checklist there. So please reference your boots on the ground manuals because they have many great resources throughout them. And I think we'll wrap up this slide, which is quickly talking about the main signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that separate it from other anxiety-related disorders. So we'll start with the main. We break them down here, starting on page 14, you'll see this. The intrusive memories, having recurring unwanted distressing memories of the event, reliving the event as if it were happening again. And that could be in the body, so feeling tension in certain parts of the body. I remember a time that my partner and I were almost held hostage by gunpoint. When I realized that the person had a gun and that I was trapped in this apartment with a chance I might not get out, instantly I felt a tightness in my chest and a guarding in my shoulders. So whenever I would tell this story to people after, I would feel the tightening in my chest and the guarding in my shoulders, and I would start to have my shoulders rise up almost in a defensive position around my neck. And at first I wouldn't realize this, but people would point it out to me. So I was almost as if I was reliving the event, not in my mind per se, like it didn't feel like it was bothering me mentally, but physically I was tensing up as if I was there. And you see this a lot with people retelling traumatic events where they start to have body language that is as if they're there again. You see this in eye movements as well. But reliving the events can be as much as hallucinations as well. I've had a friend of mine say that he's actually seen, as he's driving in his own personal car, lights flashing as if he's in his ambulance. So this is possible. So remembering the recurring unwanted distressing memories, reliving the event, upsetting dreams about the event. If you're having vivid dreams that are related to it, severe emotional distress or physical reactions, right? All those symptoms we talked about earlier. Hyperarousal is another main symptom that we see in post-traumatic stress. And it's not just in military members. It's in anybody, even children who experience PTSD. Irritable feeling of tense or on guard, feeling of overwhelming guilt or shame. That's a big one because you're not aware at the time that it's a disorder. You think it's real, this guilt and shame, but it's often a response from the trauma. Self-destructive behaviors come out here. Angry outbursts or aggressive behaviors, having arguments sometimes with loved ones that you don't even know why you're having the argument. I call that a trauma loop where you're just triggering each other. Difficulty sleeping and being on constant guard or feeling in danger and that impending doom feeling. Another main symptom is the persistence and avoidance. So anything where you're trying to avoid thinking of the event, avoiding places and objects related to it, not enjoying your activities you used to enjoy, and you can't maintain close relationships. That's the persistent avoidance symptoms. And of course, memory problems, not remembering important parts as the mind has blocked out some of these details to sometimes protect you or make you feel safer. And another main one that people can forget is the negative cognition and mood. Now, this is where you yourself have to be able to build up an ability to be self-aware. Because when you're having negative cognition and mood, a distorted sense of blame, feeling estranged from other people, increased negative feelings about yourself and self-criticism and criticizing others, that's sometimes not rooted in insight. There's a lack of insight because a lot of the times you could be feeling these things and they could feel real to you and they're very real to you, but they're not actually rooted in reality. Maybe that self-blame isn't true. Maybe you didn't do anything to deserve that blame, but because the response to trauma in the brain is trying to kind of figure out what happened and what went wrong, it's trying to correct the problem that is bothering you. It's going to try to look for those problems inside yourself. And that's the first place our brain tries to look sometimes. When it can't find the problem in the environment, it says, well, it must be me. So that negative cognition and mood is very present in post-traumatic stress, feeling hopeless about the future and feeling really diminished in your interest and ability to remember aspects of that event. So remember, these are main symptoms of PTSD that can separate it from other anxiety disorders like panic attacks and social anxiety. Those intrusive memories, the hyperarousal, the persistent avoidance, and the negative cognition and mood. And then there's a great section on page 15 about what PTSD might look like at work. So please reference this manual and remember that we all experience trauma differently, and we've all been through different protective and risk factors. So it's all about having that conversation about the person's biological factors, their psychological factors, their social factors, and other things that can help build them up and prevent them from falling into that downward spiral of hopelessness, self-blame, confusion, anger, guilt, isolation, prolonged suffering, and anxiety that makes PTSD such a high risk factor for suicide. And that's the one thing for sure. If somebody's expressing to you that they're really struggling with this disorder or the symptoms of anxiety disorders for so long, it's very normal for them to have suicidal ideations. So make sure that you do address this with them, especially if you're seeing those invitations to have the conversation about suicide. But not everybody who goes through PTSD and anxiety disorders will experience suicidal ideations. First responders are at the highest risk of suicide in Canada, I believe, at this moment, what the statistics are showing. And you can see a really good CBC POV documentary called After the Sirens that really explores this in great depth and does a great job covering all the different aspects into why first responders are highest risk of PTSD and suicide. And remember, it's that idea that we don't always have that sense of affiliation and belonging with our community because not everybody is a first responder or understands what we go through. That's why Boots on the Ground is so important on being there for our callers and letting them know that it is common, we're not alone, and that we are going to make it through this together. And then we can connect them with those resources that help build up their protective factors and help them feel connected and able to make it through into that remission phase where they're able to enjoy their quality of life again. So when somebody's talking to you and you're feeling like the conversation surrounding trauma, remember to provide the person with a sense of control, which is options and autonomy, comfort and connection, that compassion, empathy, and support. Have them drink lots of water. And I remember Sean sharing when we did this, the course around crisis intervention and crisis management, talking about drinking lots of water, the crying, urinating, and sweating is the best way to relieve stress hormones. So somebody can do lots of exercise when they're feeling triggered or activated. They could drink lots of water and have rituals set around emotional expression where they can cry out or let out some of these emotions that are built up inside of us and really give that nervous system a nice break. So remember, everyone's going to have different factors that work for them. So we want to assess the risk of harm to self or others when somebody's talking to us about trauma and anxiety, helping to make sure they're not going through a panic attack that might be a heart attack, right? We don't know. The symptoms can actually be quite similar. So if you feel that person's at risk of a real medical problem or of suicide, then make sure you're calling 911 or a crisis team. Then if they're not at risk and they're willing to share their story with you or they're looking for that connection, then build connection and understanding with your oars, pace yourself, partnership, autonomy, compassion, connect them with appropriate resources, whether it's a family doctor, a counselor, a crisis team, family and friends, or other peers that they may be comfortable with. And then discuss healthy self-care options in the physical realm of their life that are healthy coping, mental coping mechanisms, emotional self-care, and of course social self-care they can do to increase their sense of well-being when they hang up the phone. And of course, anxiety and trauma is very complex and affects everybody differently. So remind them it's a normal response to their situation and there's tons of help available. Everyone's just different in what works for them. Psychosis-related disorders can be very difficult with addressing and even talking about because although there's a lot we do know about psychosis and psychosis-related disorders, there's a lot we don't know, and a lot that Western medicine kind of gets wrong. Around the world, different cultures, different countries, different communities have different approaches to addressing when psychosis-related disorders are present, and how they integrate that person and help them learn to cope with their experiences in reality. So what exactly defines acute psychosis in our society? Well, we do see in mental health first aid it's defined as mental health problems that cause a person to lose some touch with reality. They can cause severe disturbances in behavior, thinking, and emotions. A psychotic disorder can severely disrupt a person's life. Relationships, work, and self-care can be difficult to initiate and or maintain. So is it possible that somebody could live a very healthy life experiencing altered perceptions and what we would call psychosis? Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's exactly what part of getting rid of the stigma and normalizing these things is about. It's that psychosis, of course, and psychosis-related disorders may not be extremely common as mental health problems. They still happen. They can sometimes be normal human responses to stressors in the environment. They can sometimes be coming from biological causes, genetic causes, changes in neurochemistry and vital brain structures and how they communicate. Many things can go into psychosis and what we call altered states. So it's very important that we don't just call psychosis, that we leave room to call it something like altered states of consciousness. Because psychosis itself carries negative stigma, connotations, and it kind of boxes people into the fact that it's the brain not behaving correctly. But I prefer to see it as altered states of perception or altered states of consciousness. Because people experiencing psychosis-related disorders or altered states aren't always wrong in what they're perceiving. It's that the information that's coming in through their senses and going through what's called their default mode network, the part of our brain that filters through our consciousness and all of our different sensory processes and creates what we call our perception of reality. That default mode network is so important that it integrates all the information that we are taking in so that we can interact with our environment safely and be able to face and cope with the challenges in our everyday life. Certain substances, stress, lack of sleep, when overwhelming somebody can actually cause disruption in these areas of the brain that communicate our different sensory input and then how we experience that reality. So schizophrenia, for example, there's many theories. There's beliefs that it could be changes in the brain structures, different levels of dopamine and other neurotransmitters that are responsible for how brain regions communicate. But also there are some communities, and it's evident to this, when they treat psychosis and altered states, not as a disorder, but as somebody that has diversity and that their perceptions of reality aren't wrong. They're just different because the way their brain is set up or their mind is set up. So when we treat people with a sense of normalization and help them cope and learn how to live with these experiences and integrate them into their reality, that's where somebody has the best success. So we have to remember that psychosis isn't well understood and that it's not always a disorder of their reality. It's sometimes just changes in their perceptions and how their mind is operating with the sensory input. So how do substances induce altered states? Stimulants, for example, and I work at the Safe Injection site. Some people who are addicted to methamphetamines or are using a lot of stimulants, they can be up for days. So not only is there stimulant activity in the brain that could be pushing them towards hyperarousal and towards that psychosis or altered states, but lack of sleep, stress, other factors of being homeless or marginalized can be contributing to this as well. Also previous post-traumatic stress they might be living with, as many homeless people are. When they're coming into our site in a state of psychosis, I tend to know the person's baseline if they're a regular client of mine. So I'll ask them, hey, have you gotten any sleep lately? What drugs are you using? And oftentimes I'll notice that methamphetamine mixed with lack of sleep, many times, I would say 9 out of 10, will lead somebody into a state that's altered in what we'd call psychosis. And it could lead to problems in paranoia, relationships, the ability to function, and that's where it becomes the disorder that needs help. If somebody has a diagnosis of schizophrenia or another psychosis-related disorder, but they're functioning with their daily life, they're not having issues in their physical, mental, social, legal, financial, or other senses of well-being, then that person doesn't need help or institutionalization or over-medication. Many people who live with psychosis and psychosis-related disorders can live very successful and happy lives, very healthy lives. And when that individual is educated on the disorder and they have the available supports provided to them that are effective, they have a consistent treatment and care plan that works for them, their needs are met, then it's rare for them to fall into crisis and need help. It's only when somebody's needs aren't being met. So remember that biopsychosocial model and all the stressors that can be affecting those different areas of their life. We want to be able to help that person keep track of it and build up as many strengths and protective supports as possible in all those areas. And it's rare to experience violence from somebody in psychosis unless they're made to feel threatened or activated in self-defense. And part of the way the brain is working in a state of psychosis, it might be a lot more in tune with nonverbal communication and different energies and tones that we're putting out in our communication. Many people will say that, oh, someone in psychosis, their view of reality is wrong. Well, it's not true. Sometimes it could just be hyper tuned in. Psychosis is very misunderstood. Sometimes I've spoken to people in states of psychosis where they're saying things that have no grounding in our reality. But sometimes I'll talk to somebody in a state of psychosis where everything they're saying is more real than anyone I've heard around me that's not considered to be in psychosis. People who have real profound truths they're saying. But I think it's more so sometimes the filtering that's changing in the brain, the way they filter information, the way they filter their interactions with people. So keep that in mind, that violence is often a result of us showing them nonverbal communication or tones of voice that show contempt and threat to their survival. Psychosis is very misunderstood, as I've said, and it impacts the ability to function and receive effective help. So part of our supporting someone with psychosis is pointing out those discrepancies in their perceptions empathetically, avoiding any arguing or any showing them a sense that we are an enemy to them or showing contempt. We want to be very non-judgmental and build a partnership with them. Oftentimes, I do not tell somebody that they're wrong in their perceptions. I'll just say that I'd like to understand their perceptions and I want to see where they're coming from. So there's a long history of abuse in psychiatry and in the hospitals and the medical model when it comes to psychosis. So it's very possible that people will not want help initially. They're going to feel scared about what's going to happen to them. Are they going to lose their autonomy? So that's why it's very important to have a multidisciplinary approach and have more of a family and peer support structure for somebody experiencing psychosis so they don't feel alone, isolated, and have the symptoms get worse. So remember that biopsychosocial approach is very important. Medications are not always effective, by the way, or the best solution for somebody who's going through altered states or psychosis. Some medications, chronically and long-term, can actually worsen the person's ability to experience a sense of well-being in life. Medications like quetiapine, clonopine, and clozaril, things like this, they can actually have a lot of negative side effects, and people have sometimes said they prefer to be in psychosis than on these medications long term. So what we've seen now and more recently is that when we take a biopsychosocial approach, a community support approach, and that person doesn't feel like they're broken or that they have something wrong with them, it's more that they are experiencing reality differently, and it can be a useful thing to our society, and that they can be integrated very well and express their emotions a certain way. So it's very good to have that person participating in their care model and not feeling like decisions are being made for them. The environment and social support the individual is exposed to will greatly impact their ability to cope and have a high quality of life. So remember, when it comes to assessing risk, the element of safety, we want to maintain safe distances if you're there in person, but on the phone, more importantly, we want to assess that they have an insight into their safety and the decisions they're making. And if someone's calling us in a state of psychosis and we're trying to support them in conversation and they're not coming out of that psychosis, or there's nobody that we can get them in contact with that can actively support them safely, then we will have to call a crisis team or 911. And the problem with 911 is that we're not all best trained as first responders to manage people in psychosis. Mobile crisis teams are the best, or COAST teams, where there's social workers, specially trained police officers, other mental health professionals, and even crisis nurses. They're the best trained for this. So I always think if we can't de-escalate somebody in psychosis where they cannot bring themselves to a safe sense of reality and insight, then it's best for us to connect them with a professional who can further assess them and kind of find the best place for them, whether that's an emergency room, whether it's a crisis unit, or another means. Building trust and connection is very difficult to do when you're not understanding psychosis. So I have a couple of tips below you're going to see later on, a few slides down, that have the do's and don'ts of how to build connection and understanding with someone in psychosis. Connecting someone with relevant resources, like we said, crisis line or emergency services, if they aren't coming out of that psychosis. And then support groups, crisis lines, self-help materials, nutrition, exercise, regulated sleep, family, friends, and peers. And there's many support groups out there for those who experience psychosis. Perfect. So in the next slides, we're going to read through more of the prodrome phases and acute psychosis symptoms that you can look for in somebody that might need your support. There can be many causes for the signs and symptoms of psychosis-related disorders. And there's about 4 phases that are classically known about when it comes to psychosis-related disorders. The premorbid phase, which is the time before the symptoms starting. The prodrome phase, the symptoms being vague and hardly noticeable. The acute phase, where the psychotic symptoms are experienced. So that's your hallucinations and delusions, disorganized thinking. And then the recovery phase. And with treatment, most people recover from that episode and may only have one episode and never experience another one. But some people may cycle through these 4 phases over and over again if they do have a psychosis-related disorder. And there are many different mental health disorders that can have these symptoms of psychosis. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone may go through these changes in perceptions and thinking. Some hallucinations and delusions may be present. Also with substance intoxication. That can sometimes be with certain psychedelics, with overuse of stimulants, with sometimes even with opioids. It's been seen. There's different areas where you can there's different substances that can bring on psychosis. So that might be the cause. It's not always because the person has schizophrenia or another diagnosed disorder that's obvious. It could also be depression that's so severe that they have psychosis symptoms. Also bipolar disorder. Sometimes they can, when in mania, have some of these prodrome and acute symptoms. So the two phases in psychosis that we're going to focus on here are when the person is in absolute crisis. This is where the prodrome phase or the acute psychosis phase is active, and that person is starting to lose a bit of insight into their negative impacts on their well-being, and that these symptoms are these changes in their brain and in their perceptions of reality are preventing them from being able to reach out for help. This person may reach out for help because they have some insight, because they've been educated to their disorder and they've had the right supports in place to make them self-aware. But sometimes people might enter these phases and not know that they're impacting them negatively because the experiences are so real to them that it's impossible for them to see for themselves without support. So the prodrome phase that we want to focus on first, if the person is moving into where they're starting to have changes in energy and motivation, that's a big one that we can notice, and that's depression, mood swings, anxiety, the suspiciousness and feeling of persecution, blunted emotion or inappropriate emotions, irrational anger or fear responses, especially towards family and friends they normally wouldn't, or coworkers, changes in appetite and reduced energy and motivation. So this is more subtle, but you'll see these things. Mood swings are happening in the prodrome phase we talked about there, and the paranoia and concentration issues that can sometimes be passed off for other causes. The unusual perceptions of thoughts, these are starting to come out, although they're not as obvious as hallucinations. And then they might have a sudden obsession or excessive behavior and symptoms that are similar to other disorders. So the prodrome phase, it's extremely important for this to be where they get the best intervention, where people who are aware and supportive to them in their environment, family and friends, or mental health professionals they trust, can intervene here and help build up their supports to not move into acute psychosis, where they can go back into the remission phase. These changes may first go unnoticed and they're masked by other stressors in their life, and it's important to build trust, good rapport, and non-judgmental support while they form a care plan. Normalizing their reactions and providing the right education can strengthen them enough to give them the right protective factors. Looking down at acute psychosis, so maybe that prodrome phase is not properly addressed or effectively addressed, or people are not picking up on it, or the person themselves is not picking up on it, they then can move into acute psychosis. This is where they're actively having hallucinations, delusions, which is an altered sense of reality, disorganized thinking and behavior. The words and ideas are not making sense. They might not be lining up, or sometimes they're going off on tangents that aren't connecting, or there's a lack of insight into their behaviors or their thoughts or their reality. There's a social withdrawal and can have a positive effect, we call, or negative affect. Psychosis can be, when we say a positive affect, it means there's all these present hyperarousal symptoms that are noticeable and that we usually are able to pick up on. The negative affect, that's when it's hypoarousal symptoms. There's dysfunction, there's shutting down, the social withdrawal that might go more unnoticed by friends and family. So it's very important to know that the changes in neurochemistry and functioning of certain brain structures cause these alterations in processing and perception. This can sometimes be temporary or part of a chronic condition. And we said that's the most important part of intervention, is that that's why we have the Form 1, that if someone's in acute psychosis, they can be held in a facility with professionals who can assess them and see if it's a drug that they're on that's causing it by doing blood work and medically clearing them, to see if there's an underlying medical condition like an infection or a stroke or something else going on that's causing these behaviors. And then if they pass through that phase and there's no other cause to it, they might then go on to get diagnosed with a psychosis-related disorder. But it's important to maintain consistent and non-judgmental support by friends and family and allied professionals. So we must take it upon ourselves as first responders to be very well understanding and comfortable with acute psychosis. And I run into people on a daily basis, regular clients of mine in this state, these altered states. And as long as I talk to them normal and not show that I'm affected by it and that I see them as a normal person going through an altered state, it tends to go very well, and they receive me well, and we build good trust and rapport. So remember, the do's and don'ts are going to be in the next couple slides, that if you see somebody going through a prodrome phase or an acute psychosis, use the following do's and don'ts after you've assessed risk to try and build the connection and understanding to ground them, and then be able to connect them with the appropriate supports that will get them the best relief and protection from what they're going through. And in the end, if you feel that this person is not able to come out of the psychosis, or there's no one available, friends, family, or professionals that can come over and support that individual or take over for you, then it is best to call 911 or your local crisis team for that person that can come and address them. And that's why it's best. Like 911 is great at times, but as I said, we can get the wrong call details sometimes. I've seen a lot of these calls go wrong with people in psychosis due to our own triggers internally and our trauma responses. So although a lot of the times it can go great when police and paramedics show up to someone in psychosis, the best thing to do, if possible and available, is to send a mobile crisis team or another mental health professional team that can meet them where they're at and has that extra bit of training and comfortability to give them the best possible intervention and supports, and then support them in getting them somewhere that they can get the proper care. And remember, everyone's different with what works for them, so don't assume that one treatment is going to fix everybody. Everyone's different. Some people need medications to stabilize. Some people need other biopsychosocial supports. So do your best to use the following do's and don'ts you can read on the slides below. Use your ABCD approach. Pace yourself. Partnership, autonomy, compassion, evocation. Use your oars to keep that conversation going and to build that trust and rapport. And when if you're feeling at all that they're at risk or someone else is at risk, call 911 or a mobile crisis team that can give them the effective supports. When it comes to substance use and addiction, it's very important to establish the difference between somebody who is using a substance or is prescribed a substance to enhance their quality of life or to relieve symptoms versus what's considered a substance use disorder or what some may call addiction. Addictions can be related to behaviors as well, such as gambling, sexual behaviors, or risky behaviors. But substance use disorders are related to a substance. So there's substance use disorders and addiction. They're both similar. It's just that substance use disorders related to the substance, and addictions will encompass substance use disorders and behavioral addictions as well. Addiction is the lack of control over the use of a substance or behavior, despite negative impacts on physical, mental, social, financial, legal, and emotional well-being. And this includes the symptoms of tolerance and withdrawal. So let's break that down. There is an impulsive use or lack of control over the substance or behavior, but that doesn't alone classify substance use disorder or addiction. Because what about people who are prescribed substances or are using a substance or behavior in a harm reductive approach that isn't causing them dysfunction in their life and well-being? Sometimes we have to draw a line, sort of. So, for example, if you're prescribed a benzodiazepine for anxiety, you're not addicted to that benzodiazepine by taking it every day. You're using it for a controlled purpose, a regulated purpose, or for a reason, and it's actually enhancing your ability to enjoy your life with physical, mental, social, financial, legal, and emotional impacts. So where it becomes addiction or substance use disorder is where now that use of the substance is causing negative impacts and you have an inability to cease use or cut down on use or change your relationship with that use. So physical impacts could be actual medical conditions like overdosing, like actual medical emergencies, chronic conditions that you develop from using that substance. You see this a lot with alcohol and stimulant use, where people can have with alcohol a whole host of issues with different organs in their nervous system with long-term use and abuse and misuse. And then stimulants, you see a lot of issues with the heart as well that can be caused with it. With nicotine, you see a lot of changes with blood pressure and heart as well. Benzodiazepines and alcohol have very, very dangerous withdrawals. So when encompassing the definition of addiction, we want to look at that not only is it about the use and repetitive and impulsive use of the substance, there also has to be a negative impact on physical, mental, social, financial, legal, and emotional well-being before there's a need for intervention. Mental impacts could be their inability to function. Maybe they're developing a mental health condition from it. Social, they're withdrawing socially. Financially, they're spending a lot of money on the substance or accumulating that substance or behavior. They're having legal issues, or maybe the substance or behavior is illegal, or they're ending up in jail or having legal consequences. Or maybe the substance or behavior is impacting their emotional sense of well-being, where they're feeling emotionally unregulated and maybe developing depression and anxiety from it. And then we see a tolerance as well with addiction, where the repetitive use of the substance or behavior, they build a tolerance where they need more and more or changes to it to be able to get that same hit of relief. Then we see withdrawal as well, where in the absence of the behavior or substance, they're having the signs and symptoms of withdrawal that's impacting their sense of well-being. With dependence, it's a little bit different. With dependence, we see that maybe they're not quite showing signs of addiction, where it's not so much impacting their sense of well-being in those areas of their life biopsychosocially, but there is the symptoms of tolerance and withdrawal present. So maybe, for example, I get a caffeine dependence. What changes it to be the difference between a caffeine addiction and caffeine dependence would be that maybe I grow a dependence to that caffeine, where without drinking that much coffee, I start to need more and more coffee. And when I'm not able to access my coffee, or I don't get the same amount of coffee as usual, I have withdrawal in its absence. There's an element of symptom relief there, but there's less of an impact on my impaired control, and there aren't as many negative consequences. Now, that dependency can become an addiction when maybe I'm starting to have heart palpitations. I'm starting to have issues with my sleep, issues with my bowels. I'm not eating as much. I'm starting to have negative physical, mental, social, emotional, legal, or other negative impacts on my well-being. And then I can't cease or change my relationship with that coffee or caffeine. That's when it might be classified more as a substance use disorder or addiction. So there's dependence when you're using a substance regularly building tolerance, and there's withdrawal without its presence in your system. But it only becomes addiction when there's impulsive control, there's lack of control, and there's impulsivity with the use, and there's negative impacts. So right now with cannabis legalization, there are a lot of people who misunderstand when to classify it as a cannabis use disorder. Same with opioids, because if somebody's using an opioid for profound, deep physical pain and they're prescribed it, then yes, they will become dependent over time as the brain grows new receptors and all these changes physiologically. But they may not be having negative consequences because it's being monitored by a physician, regulated supply with regulated dosing. With cannabis use, we see this where some people might overuse cannabis to the point that it does cause negative impacts in their life and they can't cease use. That would be a cannabis use disorder. But with cannabis, luckily, there aren't many physiological changes with the endocannabinoid system. So it's not like opioids, nicotine, alcohol, and benzos where you see these profound changes in the system. With cannabis, it's just that it can sometimes shift the dependence of the cannabinoid system towards needing outside THC and other cannabinoids instead of being able to access that relief with the cannabinoid system through meditation, exercise, nutrition, proper sleep, and other ways that we can access that system. So it's very important to remember that just because somebody uses a substance, it does not mean they're abusing it or misusing it. There has to be elements of impaired control where it's impacting them negatively in their sense of well-being and those elements of their life that we've talked about. And there's a dependence with tolerance and withdrawal. Remember, there's very common substances that are legal and available to us, like sugar, like caffeine, like alcohol, and other prescription drugs that cause a lot of substance use disorders and dependence. And there's a lot of things that people get confused. So remember, there's addiction, there's dependence, but people can also use any substance and still not have these impacts. I know that there's people out there that use cocaine, and the only reason that's considered a negative impact is that it's illegal. When cannabis became legalized, a lot more people no longer qualified as addiction or dependence because that legal impact was the only issue. They weren't having impacts physically or mentally. So remember, it's more complicated than just use equals abuse. There's addiction, there's dependence, and then there's just safe use. So our goal is not to diagnose somebody with addiction or substance use disorder, but to help support somebody in their journey to find safe integration of that substance or behavior as best suits their needs. And remember, there's always elements of comorbidities and mental health problems and trauma with people who use substances and have disorders with them. The reason that many people can use substances that can be addictive to others, but not to them, is that they may not have those biopsychosocial stressors. They may not have those elements of trauma that others have, and they may have a lot more protective factors, supports, and other things attributing to their sense of well-being. So that's why some people can be prescribed opioids and not become addicted, while many of the homeless population, people struggling with mental health, become addicted in such high rates. And that's also why some people can use alcohol and cannabis, other substances that alter our states of consciousness, but don't develop an unsafe relationship with that substance. There are many biopsychosocial factors, genetic factors, trauma-related factors, and supportive factors that go into whether we're going to develop a safe or unsafe relationship with a substance or behavior. And each case is different. When I worked as a paramedic, it was a lot harder for me to see these different variables because I would only ever spend often 20 minutes or less at a time with somebody who's struggling with an emergency related to a substance use or an overdose. But here working at the supervised injection sites and doing more addictions and mental health related work, I get to see how each individual client that presents himself, and I see hundreds, all have different variables leading to why they are struggling with substance use disorders and why other individuals in society wouldn't. And many times it's due to loss of control, trauma, other factors that are often outside of their control, or different genetic variables, homelessness, being marginalized, having lack of accessibility to resources and education, brain damage, other comorbidities. Those seem to be the main reasons we see that some people just can't get out of these situations on their own and need extra support, while other people who have many protective factors and supports, they don't struggle as much. it's just not as simple as get out of it. Some people want to do everything possible, but they're not as aware as how deep their predispositions go and where the roots of their addictions lie. So it's sometimes an ongoing, long battle in our society for somebody to address exactly where their use is coming from and the disorder started, and then how to find for their best situation to get out of it and which techniques are going to work best. So a multidisciplinary approach is often required for the best possible solutions. This is why addiction and substance use disorders are not a choice, but a whole wide array of causes into why some people struggle and some don't. So please check your own biases and stigmas and educate yourself onto what goes on in the brain, the changes that occur, and why it's so difficult for people to make their way out of substance use disorders when they have other factors inhibiting them. A very helpful tool to understand substance use and the issues that come from substance use is by looking at the Global Drug Survey each year. Every year they publish a new one that updates the most common drugs that are used recreationally and which ones lead to the most emergency medical treatment seeking. And they see here, once again, very similar to last year, the top 12 drugs listed here, or 13, I should say. We have heroin at the very top with novel drugs just below it. And I like to call those two or put those two together because with heroin, they're usually cut with novel drugs. It's usually cut with novel drugs like fentanyl and analogs of fentanyl and benzodiazepines we're seeing quite commonly. Public health releases every so often the testing results from the safe injection sites of the different drug samples that come through that we test to see what's in them. And a lot of the times we're seeing these very powerful benzodiazepines and these analogs of fentanyl that we haven't seen before. Because as the black market has control over these drugs, they are continually changing them chemically to be able to get through border crossings and to be able to sneak past federal agencies. So it becomes this game, almost like a chess match. So yes, that's why heroin and novel drugs are so high on the list. They're constantly evolving, they're increasing in potency, and there are these new benzodiazepines that are weighing in. And working at these supervised injection sites, when somebody comes in with the top 3 drugs there, which is usually going to be heroin, fentanyl, or methamphetamine, that's our top 3 we're seeing over and over. It's not just those 3 drugs that they have. It's going to be cut with several other chemicals that they're usually not aware of. And only some of our sites offer drug testing for our clients. So it'd be great to have more drug testing available so people can avoid these harms. So anyways, we're seeing with heroin and novel drugs and meth, when it's cut with fentanyl or benzos, people go down hard. And I mean quick. Some people within, as they've just injected, they are down. Blue in the face, not breathing, full respiratory arrest, requiring us to resuscitate them. But because we're right there when it happens, there are no deaths at these sites. We're able to resuscitate people successfully because we're there right away. The problem, and where we're seeing the harms of the top 3 drugs there, and this is according especially to Health Canada, they've done a lot of assessment of this, and the lack of social support increases chance of death and physical health problems. Lower drug tolerance when people are in and out of rehabs or in and out of treatments and they're not being followed or supported adequately, and then they fall back and they get a hold of a very potent version of the drug they were recently struggling with. Polysubstance use, people using many different drugs together and mixing them. And that's definitely going to be an issue with things like alcohol and benzodiazepines, which are potentiators for a lot of substances, meaning they enhance some of those dangerous effects. Being alone at the time of overdose. So one of the things our safe injection sites offer people is we're there as medical professionals to respond and even prevent the overdoses from happening. It's when people are using alone, that's when they fall unresponsive, they stop breathing, there's no one there to wake them up or to give them Narcan in time or oxygen, and then they succumb. The history of mental health problems and trauma, those are the huge barriers we see right now with people dying from those top three substances. There is that the high barriers, the stigma, and the trauma that goes into the repeated use, and that people are not having their needs met and they're not getting to the roots of their trauma. And that's why they're repeatedly using these substances as a form of symptom relief from absolute suffering. And then again, at the bottom there, they show a lack of comprehensive and coordinated healthcare. So that's why those top three are so high on that list and they're so dangerous. But with safe supply, that's been recently, because of COVID-19, we've been able to get through successfully the safe supply agenda. So now we are going to be offering safe Dilaudid to replace street heroin and street fentanyl, where we're giving people 8 milligram Dilaudids to help them move off of the street substances, where it's a regulated dose they're having every day that they can eventually cut down, regulate, stabilize, remain optimal instead of fluctuating between over and underdosing and withdrawal. And then we're able to help them with their basic needs, like getting them shelter, getting them jobs, and things like that. Next, we see synthetic cannabinoids, because cannabis itself has an entourage effect when you smoke it or consume it, where there's many different terpenes, including the cannabinoid CBD, which balances out THC and balances out some of the unfavorable psychostimulant effects that people tend to get paranoid or have altered states of consciousness from with cannabis. There's usually a whole wide array of terpenes in there that are balancing that out, creating the entourage effect. But synthetic cannabis and synthetic cannabinoids, it's basically like isolating that THC, which is great when it's mixed with things and not too high in dose, but it's like taking that THC, isolating it and synthesizing it, and that's just going right after those CB1 receptors and causing increased massive psychostimulant effects, because there's nothing to block it out, there's nothing to balance it out. It's just having full effects on the nervous system, and that's why you have a lot more adverse effects with it, more psychosis with it. Sometimes you're seeing seizures, and it's not good, because synthetic cannabinoids can be very dangerous and harmful, whereas regular cannabis tends to have a lot more fail-safes that we'll talk about later in the list. So then GHB, of course, many first responders have been called to people overdosing on GHB because it's so easy to tip the scale from what they'd call a happy dose or a therapeutic dose, where they're feeling comfortable and socially, happy. But then if they take just a little too much, and it's hard because they usually dissolve it into a liquid, so they just taking a little too much of that liquid, boom, they can move into sedation and respiratory depression, especially when they're drinking alcohol and taking other drugs with it. So GHB does have a higher rate of emergency room visits. Alcohol, very high on the list. Although it's legalized and we have a lot of education, we have harm reduction, we have all these different things in place, there's still a lot of harms that come from alcohol, from the fact that it blocks emotional processing, it creates impulsivity, it takes away our ability to reason and problem solve in the moment. And the more you drink, the more that it has these dangerous effects. And especially alcoholism itself has many, 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 many harmful physical effects. Withdrawing on alcohol is deadly, just like benzodiazepines. If you try to quit cold turkey, if you've been using it frequently at high levels, you can die of a seizure. You can have a lot of different effects with the nervous system, the heart, the kidneys, blood vessels, everything. But when used properly and safely and moderated, you can follow Canada's drinking guidelines. They do have those available. You can look it up. Canada's safe drinking guidelines. Follow those and you'll have a lot less chance of harm. But remember, there's a lot of genetic factors into alcoholism. There's a lot of roots with trauma. And also using alcohol to cope is actually a really high risk factor. A lot of murders, assaults, a lot of suicides happen when people are under the influence of alcohol because of its effects on the brain in high doses. So make sure that if you are someone who enjoys your alcohol, and I don't mind having a beer once in a while, make sure you only know what's best for your body. And follow Canada's drinking guidelines, please. And then we have MDMA, where MDMA is in its purest form, does not have the same neurotoxic and hemodynamic effects on heart rate, blood pressure, things like that. MDMA in its purest form is more of an entactogen, and it's used now in therapy to heal to heal PTSD. I'm very tired today. To heal PTSD and to help people work through trauma with psychotherapy. But when used recreationally in the wrong setting, it can lead to adverse effects like crisis and such when you're using it, in an area where you could be triggered with trauma. And also if it's cut with something dangerous, where usually recreational MDMA is not pure, it's going to be cut with amphetamines, methamphetamine, methadone, or other different substances that can be dangerous on the heart and brain and other organs. So when used therapeutically with a therapist, MDMA has almost no adverse effects, and it's wonderfully effective for post-traumatic stress disorder when used in therapy under proper guidelines. But recreationally, we see a lot of harms with it being cut with dangerous chemicals and with people using it with the wrong intentions, causing psychological harm. But it's lower on the list because now we're moving it away from recreational use and trying to cap it under that nice therapeutic use instead. Cocaine. Okay, a lot of the times with cocaine, there's a lot of different things changing in it all the time, making its dangers go up and down. One of the things is that cocaine does not have consistent potency ever for people, so it's very common for people to hit a hot spot with cocaine or get a very potent batch through once in a while that they overdose on by accident. And also, I've been seeing it cut with fentanyl quite often, and that's another thing that we're seeing in the front lines. Fentanyl is now making its way into anything that's powdered. Amphetamine, a little bit lower than cocaine. Why is amphetamine lower than methamphetamine? Because amphetamines are typically used prescribed. But the problem is recreationally, people are going to be buying them from people with prescriptions or, taking them from things like diet pills, ADHD medication, and using it recreationally instead. So that's the big harm with amphetamines is that, yes, people are prescribed it for things like ADHD and, as other purposes needed for stimulants, or that stimulants are prescribed for. But when used recreationally or when people are taking them without it being monitored by a doctor, there is a higher chance of addiction, of harms on the heart, and just really problems with sleep. That's another big thing we see at the injection sites is people who use high doses of amphetamines and methamphetamines, they go days without sleeping, and that causes a lot of harm on the body. Then LSD, of course, same problem with MDMA. LSD, if it's cut with things like the N-bomb family, the 2CB N-bomb family, it can be quite harmful, but when used therapeutically in its purest form and at low levels, it's not as harmful. So again, we're seeing with psychedelics this common trend of when used recreationally and unregulated, it can be harmful because of the psychological effects and the physical effects when they're cut with dangerous chemicals. But when used therapeutically, there are these wonderful tools for helping people work through addictions, traumas, and severe depression. But the key is they're used therapeutically. They're used with a protocol by a professional who understands their effects on the brain, how to set a good set and setting, and how to actually guide you through that experience to get the most out of it and to avoid the pitfalls and harms of crisis. So that's the caution to say is that although you're seeing all this wonderful research come out about psychedelics, make sure that that when people ask you about them or if you're faced with a decision to take them, you're remembering that the benefits lie within the therapeutic use, not the recreational use. Perfect. Ketamine. There we go. Why is it so low in the list? Not because it's harmless. It has a lot of abuse potential, can be very addictive, and it can cause a lot of harms when used incorrectly. But it is used therapeutically a lot now in the emergency room, and it doesn't have as many hemodynamic effects and dangers with blood pressure and heart rate as benzodiazepines and other sedatives. Cannabis and magic mushrooms are so low on the list because there aren't any real deaths that can be attributed to overdose. Most of the time people are having harms with cannabis and magic mushrooms. They're either laced or people are using them in the wrong set and setting or with the wrong dose for their body. And that's a huge thing with cannabis that people have to remember. With edibles being legal now and different forms of cannabis being legalized, we have to remember that everyone's body reacts differently. But the good news is no one has really died from cannabis itself. Now, I'm sure if you have a heart problem and you have a panic attack on cannabis, that's not great, just like going on a roller coaster wouldn't be. If you are taking cannabis somewhere in public or somewhere that is not a safe setting, you can, fall in the water or something or fall off something high. That's not good. But make sure that if you use cannabis, just follow the public health guidelines. And if you're a first responder using it for a mental health problem, don't just do it blindly or self-medicate with it. Follow a doctor's orders. Get a prescription from a doctor and ask them which strains will help you the most, because some strains of cannabis can be very effective for mental health problems. Some can be very harmful. So it's not just as simple as cannabis is good or bad. It's about what strains are good for which people at which times for which reasons. So cannabis, because it's becoming legalized, education's being put out there, awareness is being raised of the harms and how to use it safely, and the research is increasing around it. That's why it's so low on the list. So of course, there are harms with cannabis if it's used incorrectly, but when used properly and when guidelines are followed, it's one of the more safer substances to use. Magic mushrooms. That's another one where you hear a lot of research around its effects on curing depression or helping with depression, helping with addiction. But when used incorrectly, or when you have a lot of trauma, or you're in states of stress in your life, it can put you into really bad states of mental health or put you into a crisis. And if you don't have proper supports, that can be very harmful for you. And it can cause PTSD if you have a very powerful psychedelic experience that overwhelms you and no one's there to support you. So the idea with magic mushrooms, yes, they're low on the list, but when used incorrectly, they can cause psychological harms or physical harms if you use them somewhere that's not a safe setting. So again, the reason that psychedelics can be very helpful is that they're used therapeutically with professionals who understand the dosing, know the source they're getting it from, and they have a ritual or a guide on how to guide you through or take you through that experience to actually get the most out of it. So hopefully this helps, knowing that from top to bottom, there's reasons they're listed this way. The Global Drug Survey is available online. It's free online, and it's published every year. And it breaks down by several categories how these substances are consumed by society, their good and bad effects, and where the future could be with research. So good. Hopefully this helps. And remember, when someone calls us and they're struggling with a substance that's on this list or a common substance, the idea is not to tell them that it's bad or something like that, or blame them or judge them for it, but to remember that everyone uses substances for different reasons. You all use coffee and sleeping pills and alcohol and cannabis or whatever it is that we all use to enhance our lives. It's all about how we use them and our relationship with these substances. And if somebody has a good relationship with a substance and it's not impacting them physically, mentally, socially, legally, financially, or emotionally, then we don't have to worry about it. But if someone calls us and they're telling us that a substance, they have a poor relationship with a substance, or it's harming them somewhere in those realms, our goal is to remember that people use substances for a reason, find out why they're using it, what benefits they see from using the substance, and then what they feel they can do to cut down, or what goals they feel they can reach, whether it be abstinence, harm reduction, relapse prevention, or what have you. And don't ever forget that it's often trauma, deep emotional trauma, that is driving the substance use disorder that you're seeing. And it's often also worsening of a mental health problem that's underlying, which is why people gravitate to different substances. People with depression and depressive symptoms will gravitate to more stimulants and more psychedelics, while people who are more hyperarousal will gravitate towards more depressants and such. Where bipolar disorder, you see a lot more fluctuation. So if somebody's using these substances to soothe trauma, then that's what their goal will be with the substance, and why it's causing such a disorder in their life is that it seems to be helping them, and they're seeing the positives more than the negatives. And then if somebody's using it to cope with a mental health disorder, then they're going to be using a substance that complements the symptoms that they're struggling with. When somebody seeks out support or assistance with their mental health, and there's a substance use disorder or behavioral addiction that is part of that problem or part of the puzzle piece to what they're struggling with, we don't want to make the choice as a peer supporter or a coworker to point out to them that it's an addiction they're struggling with, or that the substance use is the main problem they're going through, when really it might be their depression, their anxiety, their post-traumatic stress, brain damage, chronic pain, other biopsychosocial factors that are really the main problem in their life. Maybe they were using this substance or behavior before they were struggling, and it wasn't impacting them negatively in those aspects of their well-being. Maybe there was something that happened or something they started to struggle with that changed their relationship with that substance or behavior. So when somebody calls and they're mentioning substance use or behavioral disorders, addictions, we want to first assess the risk. How much do they feel the substance use or behavior is impacting their ability to function, their legal, emotional, physical, mental, social, and other areas of well-being? Are they getting intoxicated or impaired in situations where they're putting themselves at risk or others at risk? Or where they might be able, where it may give them negative consequences and impacts on their life. And then if they're not actively intoxicated or impaired in threatening themselves or others, and they're not actively overdosing when they're calling us on the phone, then we can move on to building connection and understanding. Now, if somebody calls us and they're intoxicated, but they're not at risk, it doesn't mean we shut down the conversation. Sometimes people are only at liberty to reach out when they have a substance in their system that makes them feel more like having their guard down. They feel safer from that substance, like having a drink or two or smoking a joint, or maybe they do take an opioid or something to calm down that allows them to call us and reach out, where otherwise they wouldn't when they're in withdrawal or in their crisis mode. So it's not that the person's intoxicated that alarms us, is that are they impaired to the point where they're at risk or somebody else is, or are they overdosing? And if they're not, then we want to move on to the B, the building connection and understanding their perspectives on how their substance use or behavior is impacting their life, and helping using that DEERS approach, that developing discrepancies in some of the things that they're saying if they don't feel they have an insight. But we want to make sure that we're expressing empathy, that all human beings can struggle with substance use and behaviors. We want to avoid arguing with them. If we don't agree with their perspective, that doesn't mean that we're right. We don't know all the biopsychosocial factors that are impacting their substance use disorder. So we want to roll with resistance and support their self-efficacy, that eventually they will be the ones that, with some proper support, to find the best solution for their problem. So we want to make sure we keep that in mind. There are many different ways to address substance use disorders. Abstinence is one that used to be touted the most, and it's not actually the most successful. Abstinence can help some people when they feel that their biopsychosocial factors are in order, they're feeling adequately supported, all their needs are being met to where they're optimally functioning with their well-being, and then they no longer wish to have that substance or behavior be a part of their life. That is their choice, and if abstinence is best for their situation, we can support them in that, and connecting them with a rehab or a detox or a resource like a RAM clinic, or which is a rapid access addiction medicine, or other service to help them achieve abstinence. Narcotics and Alcoholics Anonymous is another service that works for this too. Now, what if they don't want abstinence, or they're not ready for abstinence? Maybe they're using a substance that is dangerous or illegal, but they're not ready to stop completely. Or they wish to change their relationship in a way that it's not causing those harms on them physically, socially, mentally, legally, financially, whatever. That's a harm reduction approach. So we want to increase their education, empower them to change their relationship with that substance, to safely use it to achieve the symptom relief that they're looking for out of the substance, but not suffer those negative consequences. So the supervised injection sites and consumption treatment services and most addictions approaches now are taking a harm reduction lens and a trauma-informed lens, that all people use substances. Most times when the substance use becomes out of control, it's due to trauma or a relationship with it in combination with their biopsychosocial factors. So harm reduction at our sites will help the person get clean, safe gear to use their drugs, whether it be clean crack pipes, clean needles. We teach them how to use it safely, safe injection practices, sterile, clean techniques. We help them monitor their dosing. And unfortunately, because safe supply isn't widely available yet, they're still using unpredictable street drugs that they're getting from dealers and from overseas and from different cuts and different things that are put into the drug that make it very unsafe and harmful. So what the idea with safe supply is, it increases the capacity of harm reduction to empower the person with safe, careful dosing, just like anybody that's prescribed a painkiller for a broken hip or something, or long-term pain. But they're not at risk of overdose because it'll be controlled dosing with a controlled, safe supply of an opioid that will replace the street drug and prevent them from having that up and down of the hyperarousal, the withdrawal and tolerance changes, and the risks of overdose. And also, using things without a harm reduction approach puts you at increase for injury as well, and medical conditions like endocarditis from injecting drugs that are with dirty needles, having sepsis, or having skin issues and things like that. There are many issues, and also psychological harms with using substances that aren't safe or having a consistent supply. So there's abstinence, where you want to completely avoid the behavior or substance if their biopsychosocial factors allow for that. Or there's harm reduction, where maybe all they need is some education and help avoiding the health consequences of that substance use or behavior. And with harm reduction with sex, for example, trying to maintain consistent partners, trying to have them use condoms, to get tested for STDs regularly. These are other examples of harm reduction. With alcohol, it's maintenance of alcohol to the point where they're not overusing it, where maybe they're cutting down their drinks per day and things like that. The third option that we see most commonly now come out in addictions and mental health is structured relapse prevention, where the person wants to change their relationship with that substance or behavior. So it's kind of a bit of taking harm reduction a step further, where not only are they educated and avoiding the health consequences, but now they're taking a look at their behavior and the substance use and where it relates to their traumas, their past, their biopsychosocial factors and stressors, and how they can change their relationship with their drinking, drug use, behavior, to be able to now not have it impact them negatively and maybe enhance their ability to enjoy their life. So with opioids, you'll see that a lot with the safe supply, people being able to get a doctor's guidance. With cannabis use for post-traumatic stress disorder, the idea is we want to use cannabis in a way that it's enhancing our sense of well-being without causing dependence and worsening of symptoms. And having like a professional guide you with that is very helpful. So please explore these different approaches in your own time and educate yourself on what's out there and what services will provide the person with an abstinence-based approach, a harm reduction approach, or a structured relapse prevention approach. And sometimes educating clients on what each of these approaches entail and asking them what they feel is best for them will empower them to want to seek that help earlier. And also reducing the stigma and reminding them that substance use disorders are normal and common with human beings who have various biopsychosocial causes, and there's often trauma that is deeply rooted in the disorder. There's also many other approaches and many ways to address problematic substance use explored on a case-by-case basis, sometimes by a multidisciplinary approach. And that could be parallel together or sequential approaches that don't really work together. So keep in mind, there are many approaches and many causes. So our best thing to do is support the person on their journey, help assess that risk for them, build connection and understanding, and then connect them with appropriate resources to help them reach their goals. And then discuss healthy self-care and coping that is not related to that substance or behavior in the physical realm of well-being that they can use to overcome some of those triggers, some self-care they can use mentally that is not related to the substance or behavior, social self-care, and then emotional self-care to help them regulate that nervous system to not need the substance as much. Due to our understanding that post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma in general, is tightly linked to addiction and substance use disorders, we have to look at it as a very common human response, and especially with first responders, because of the high stress that is related to the career, the constant exposures to trauma that goes unprocessed. It's very easy for that to build up over time and overwhelm us to the point where we might start using a substance or behavior without realizing that we're entering a state of impulsivity with it or lack of control. And sometimes we need other people to help us recognize that our relationship with a substance or behavior is becoming risky or becoming negative in its impacts on our sense of well-being. Someone may normally go out for a couple beers after a shift, or maybe have a few drinks on a weekend or with friends and family. Someone might actually smoke a joint once in a while, or try to, maybe gets prescribed a painkiller or prescribed a benzodiazepine or prescribed cannabis or something, that they start out having a very normal relationship with it where it's enhancing their life. The other side of it is where maybe they come across this substance or behavior recreationally at a time in their life where their biopsychosocial factors, current stressors and crisis they're going through, where that behavior or substance takes away that pain and suffering they're going through. And it's so powerful that it hardwires them to then have that predisposition to have a substance use disorder with it. In either situation, oftentimes they enter what's called the pre-contemplation stage, where the physical, mental, social, financial, and legal impacts and risky use, even impaired control, is present, but that person does not yet have insight, because their perceptions of it positively impacting their life outweigh the negative. And it could be that they at first had a very positive relationship with this substance or behavior, and it wasn't impacting them. And now that switch over to where it is, due to changes in biopsychosocial factors, new traumas, other changes, they don't notice that it's now impacting them negatively. So when they're in that pre-contemplation stage, we have to help, as good peer supporters, help them recognize that maybe it is causing them impacts. So when we're listening to their story and we're building connection and understanding, using our ORs, our open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarization, maybe in that story that they're telling us, they mention a physical problem that the substance or behavior caused. A mental health problem, a social issue where it broke up a relationship. Maybe they got fired from their job because of it. Maybe they got pulled over for drunk driving, or, something that indicates risky or impaired control. But they're not, telling us that they see that. Well, then we want to point out those discrepancies and remind them of some of those things they're telling us, but while expressing empathy. So avoiding arguing and telling them that they're not seeing it correctly and that they're wrong, that's not good. We want to roll with the resistance that if they say to you, well, I don't believe I'm getting an addiction. Well, I don't think I'm drinking too much. We don't want to say, well, you are. We might want to fall back on pointing out, well, you did say you got pulled over for drunk driving. And I mean, that got you fired. And I'm not, as human beings, it's normal to use coping mechanisms like alcohol when we're stressed out. But I'm concerned that because of that drunk driving charge, maybe that's a sign that your relationship with alcohol has changed a bit. But I also understand that I don't know your entire life, and you're the one who best knows your situation. I'm just here to support you. So that's how I use that DEERS approach. Develop discrepancies, express empathy, avoid arguing, roll with resistance, and support self-efficacy. Sometimes at the safe injection sites, we'll have a client that has just overdosed, but because of the fact that when they come out of it, they feel so good because we give them all the oxygen they need, and we don't deprive them of, we don't give them brain damage. We don't always give them Narcan. Sometimes they'll come out of it not feeling as if they overdosed, and they don't always believe us. So I sometimes have to show them the oxygen mask, or have to show them the bag valve mask that I use to breathe for them. And then the reality sets in, and they don't want to use again right away. They might sit down a bit and chat with us about their where they are in their life and about some of their recovery goals. So when someone's in the pre-contemplation stage, we don't want to bog them down with stressors and stigma. We want to support them in recognizing that they have a problem from their own eyes. And then when they reach the contemplation stage, the next part there, they start to gain insight to maybe the problem having negative consequences, but they're not quite ready to make a change. So this is a bit better than being in pre-contemplation, where you think, oh, there's no issue at all. I'm just going to keep behaving the same way, and I don't see these negative consequences. What are these people talking about? But contemplation is where there is some self-awareness. There is some insight. But the biopsychosocial factors in their life, the pain and suffering, has not been addressed. Their needs are not met yet. So they're not going to be able to make that change. So at that point, as a peer supporter, we want to talk to them more about what biopsychosocial factors, what protective factors and supports do they feel they need that would help them move into preparation. So that preparation phase, if they're able to move there, they're now ready to make the changes. Maybe their needs are starting to be met. They get stable housing. Their financial needs are met. They have a good relationship. They're connected with family and friends. They feel a sense of belonging. They're moving up their hierarchy of human needs. And they feel a sense of optimal functioning that they can face challenges now. The problem is when it comes to substance use and addictions care, people tend to try to jump to the preparation phase and push them through into action. But we need to support them moving through these phases at their own pace because there's various biopsychosocial factors that put people in each area. So when they're ready to make the changes, we want to help them plan effectively and realistically and strategize how they're going to make their best decisions on going forward in action. So are they going to use a harm reduction approach, an abstinence approach, or do they want structured relapse prevention or something else entirely? Make sure they spend as much time in the preparation phase as they feel comfortable before moving to action. Then the action phase, they're making the changes. They're starting to work towards those goals. They're separating themselves from the triggers, the environments, and the behaviors that cause their relapsing. And they're starting to actually actively improve their life, build up their supports and sense of well-being. Then the maintenance phase, they finally reached that goal that they were hoping for. They've either got abstinence achieved, or they've cut down on the substance use to where it's no longer impacting them negatively, or they've changed their relationship. That's wonderful. We want to help them stay in this phase by building up their self-care. So that discussing healthy self-care and coping, making sure they have really good physical outlets where they can exercise a lot, meditate, eat healthy, sleep well, make sure they're regulated in those biological needs. Then mentally, they're increasing their sense of discipline. They're learning new life skills. They're enhancing their coping mechanisms in life. Socially, they're building up friends, family, support groups. Maybe they're getting a job if they didn't have one already, or they're enhancing their relationships at work. And then emotional well-being. They're seeking out emotional regulation and nervous system regulation outside of substance use and behaviors, where they're more healthy and evidence-based self-care techniques. So we can help them with that. And then relapse is actually normal and it's part of recovery. So if someone returns to that behavior or substance or that pattern that was causing harm, we are not supposed to address it as a failure. So if a first responder calls boots on the ground and they're in the relapse phase and they're in crisis because they've just used a substance or they've just relapsed into a behavior that they're ashamed of, and they're reaching out to us for support, we should do our best to listen to them non-judgmentally, validate and normalize relapse, that it's the brain just trying to hold that control, that it can take years and there's many factors into someone's recovery, that maybe there's a biological need that wasn't being met. Maybe there's a psychological stressor that was affecting them and overwhelming them. Maybe they weren't being socially supported enough, and maybe they lost their job or there's a new thing that's happened to them, or maybe emotionally they're not being regulated properly. When someone relapses, it's a learning opportunity. So we should be reframing it as that they're not a failure, that just means they're human, and that people will relapse many times often before they finally find what works best for them. And that we can reframe to them that maybe it means that there is something they're missing in their toolkit. Maybe there's a biological need that wasn't being met, a psychological need, a social need. We can take them through that map, remind them of the hierarchy of human needs, and that they need to just be supported to one day get back to that again. And that this is sometimes an upward cycle where they might go through these different stages over and over, but eventually they will find what works for them. So remind them that it's normal, validate them, get them back into a conversation of positively reframing the relapse best you can, and then help them find the supports. Remind them of what worked before. Ask them about that. What worked before for you? What supports would you like to reach out to now? Is there anything that you haven't tried that I can help connect you with? And that's how you use the stages of change to help somebody who's struggling. So to tie up and summarize the section on substance use and addiction, there are many biopsychosocial factors that put people at risk or protect people from substance use disorders and addictions. So it's not up to a person's character, weaknesses, or anything like that. It's more so about all these different factors, and that trauma is tightly linked to it, and that there's many different pathways to gaining control over your life again with an addiction or substance use disorder, and that one shoe doesn't fit everybody, so that they just need adequate supports, encouragement, and validation that it's a normal part of human nature. That yes, maybe they do want abstinence, and abstinence may be possible, but to be realistic, that there might have to just start with a harm reduction approach or a structured relapse prevention approach. And with things like alcohol and benzos, they should not be cutting out cold turkey because there's dangerous consequences to those withdrawals. That maybe there's a substance they can move to, like if somebody is struggling with opioids. There's much evidence coming out now that cannabis is a great stepping stone to helping somebody cut down on opioids or move away from it completely, because cannabis does not have the same risks of overdose or anywhere close to the same consequences as opioids when they're misused. But yes, sometimes there's harm reduction, sometimes there's abstinence, and sometimes structured relapse prevention. But the best thing to do is to remind the person that the approach they were trying before just may not have been the effective one for them. So they just need to try something else and eventually find what works for them. So use that ABCD approach to assess for risk, build connection and understanding about the substance use disorder, connect them with appropriate professional resources, and then discuss those healthy self-care techniques that they can use to help improve their sense of well-being right now. And then those ORs, those open-ended questions, those affirmations and normalization of their situation, you're reflectively listening to them non-judgmentally and summarizing for them what they're going through, and pacing yourself. Build partnership, maintain their autonomy, show compassion, and help them evoke their best solution to their problems. Thank you all for successfully making it to the end of this mental health training for first responders and emergency workers. My goal here was to take a lot of the training you've done up to this point, a lot of the training you've done through your careers, and tie it together with a lot of the updates and the most current understandings in addictions and mental health to help you best be empowered to be there to support your callers and other people through your career that you come to contact with who need your support. And to remember these key learning points. Mental health problems affect everyone differently. There are many biopsychosocial factors that come into why certain people struggle more than others, and why some people have protective factors that allow them to cope effectively, while others might fall into situations where they're not coping the same as they once did. Many factors. Mental health struggles are not a sign of weakness or character flaw, and we should do our best to try and reframe this to people and let them know and remind them this and assure them so that they don't beat themselves up so much that they lose that optimism to eventually get better. We also want to remember that there are effective supports and treatments available for those who suffer, and reflect that to our callers best we can. Self-care is just as important as helping others. So we have to also remember for ourselves to take care of ourselves first, and to also remind the people that are calling at the end of the phone call, especially before we hang up that phone, to remind them to take care of themselves and remember that there are physical, mental, social, and emotional categories that we should be filling in our lives to enhance our sense of well-being and ability to face those mental health challenges that we come across. So follow your ABCDs, try to pace yourself, and use your oars when you get stuck. Below, I have a bunch of resources that you can use, some deep breathing technique that I've shared there, some health and wellness tools that you can use, some general signs of mental health problems in the workplace. There's the mental health continuum below there that Road to Mental Readiness has created that's very effective for self-monitoring. And then I've also listed some YouTube links to some very good videos to take you a bit more in depth with certain mental health disorders. So thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please reach out to me at jmitchell.services@gmail.com. That's my best email to catch me for any addictions and mental health related questions. Or if you want to chat with me about a certain case you've had that had addictions and mental health component to it, or you simply just want some access to some more resources, feel free to reach out to jmitchell.services@gmail.com. Thank you very much, and take care of yourself.